Today, May 17th, is an auspicious day to hold a webinar exploring issues of diversity and inclusion, as it marks International Day Against Homophobia, Transphobia and Biphobia. This webinar, Towards Diverse and Inclusive Policing, Practitioners and Researchers in Conversation, emerged from an Irish Fulbright Commission Alumni Award to Dr Aoife Delaney in 2021. Aoife is a research manager in the Policing Authority and was an NUI Fulbright awardee in 2017. She is responsible for organising today's event, which has been co-funded by the Irish Fulbright Commission and the Policing Authority. As you can imagine, there has been a tremendous amount of effort and coordination across the world involved in bringing this event together. With the theme of exploring issues of diversity and inclusivity in policing, we invited many people of different ethnicities and backgrounds to participate. The complexities of international scheduling meant that not everyone we invited was able to attend today. We are focusing today on conversations between practitioners and researchers in this area, so there are no community stakeholders included in today's panels. It is envisioned that a similar event, which will include stakeholders, may occur in the future. Diversity is a cornerstone of the work that both the Policing Authority and the Fulbright Commission do. Diversity forms part of the vision for the Policing Authority, who are currently in the process of evaluating research tenders to understand diverse and minority communities in Ireland experience of policing. The Fulbright Commission established a voluntary diversity, equity and inclusion panel of Fulbright alumni, whose research, work and personal experiences provide insights into the areas of DEI and give a voice to underrepresented communities. The panel provides consultation on how the Commission can improve and maximise accessibility, advance equity and enhance awardee support. Before I introduce you to our first speaker of the day, I'd like to take you through a few points on housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded. It will be made available on the Policing Authority and the Irish Fulbright Commission's YouTube channels in the next couple of weeks. I would like to thank Vanessa O'Connell and Cormac Leonard for providing Irish Sign Language translation throughout today's webinar. Should you wish, please pin the ISL window and select side-by-side viewing to keep the ISL window open beside the speakers or videos. You can also resize the ISL window as you prefer. You may also choose to switch on subtitles to view live, automatically generated closed captions. Please use the Q&A feature instead of the chat window to contribute your questions and comments to the panelists during our open Q&A sessions. The format for today will see 2 short welcoming addresses, followed by 2 panel sessions with a 10-minute comfort break between them, finishing up with closing remarks. The panelists in both sessions will outline the themes of particular interest to them before opening the conversation. You are invited to join in this conversation by adding your comments and questions through the Q&A feature. And again, please use that Q&A feature rather than the chat window, as the chat may not be monitored during the event. Depending on which side of the Atlantic you are on, I trust that you will find the sessions this morning or this afternoon to be both interesting and engaging. And now I am very pleased to introduce our first speaker, the Minister for Justice, Ms. Helen McEntee, TD. Ms. McEntee was appointed Minister for Justice in June 2020. She is a TD for Meath East, first elected to Dáil Éireann in a by-election in March 2013 and re-elected in the February 2016 general election. She previously served as Minister for Health and Older People at the Department of Health and Minister for State for EU Affairs.
Hi everyone, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with you today, and I want to start by thanking Fulbright and the Policing Authority for the kind invitation to discuss this important topic of working towards diverse and inclusive policing. As I'm sure all of you are aware, this year we are marking the centenary of An Garda Síochána, and it is therefore a very appropriate time for us to continue our discussions on the development of our policing service. Over its first 100 years, An Garda Síochána has faced a succession of challenges, from establishing the trust of the people following years of unrest and war, to the emergency, the troubles, the growth of organised crime, COVID-19 and many other challenges over the lifetime of the force. And of course, with the changing landscape of our country and the ever more sophisticated types of criminal behaviours, comes the necessity for review and development in how we approach our policing. Since the publication in 2018 of the report of the Commission on the Future of Policing in Ireland and a Policing Service for Our Future, the Government's action plan for the implementation of the Commission's recommendations, significant progress has been made on delivering what is a very ambitious reform programme. The first principle for policing, security and community safety identified by the Commission is that human rights are the foundation and the purpose of policing, and this principle is central to the reform programme which is currently underway. Following the report of the Commission, An Garda Síochána established a human rights section, which subsequently developed a human rights strategy from 2020 to 2022. A key goal of the strategy is that all Garda personnel will be trained in a human rights-based approach to policing. Very much aligned to the strategy then, An Garda Síochána introduced further measures to enhance the human rights approach to policing, such as the re-establishment of the Garda Strategic Human Rights Advisory Committee, the appointment of a Garda Human Rights Legal Advisor to advise operational commanders, and the placing of human rights, along with the Code of Ethics, at the centre of the Garda decision-making model. And Garda Síochána also published key policy documents, including the Human Rights Framework, the Human Rights Screening Tool, and the Operational Guidance Document to assist Garda personnel. The Garda Síochána Diversity and Integration Strategy, which ran from 2019 to 21, reflects the organisation's strong commitment to engage proactively and respectfully with all members of society, delivering on the organisation's obligations on human rights and equality under Irish, under EU law and international conventions. I understand that work is ongoing to develop a successor equality, diversity and inclusion strategy, and I think we all look forward to seeing it. In addition to the Garda National Diversity Forum, I also welcome the recent establishment of An Garda Síochána's Dublin 15 Community Inclusion Forum. It is the first such local forum, and I really hope that it will help to build a better relationship between Gardaí and the community in that particular area. While this work is key, it's also important that when communities deal with An Garda Síochána, they see members and staff working in the organisation from within their own communities. To this end, the Commission on the Future of Policing recommended that An Garda Síochána should reflect the diversity of Irish society, including at the top layers of the organisation. Both myself and the Commissioner felt that it was really important that a particular emphasis was placed in the recent Garda recruitment competition on encouraging women and people from minority groups to consider a career with the Gardaí. And I'm really heartened that approximately 40% of applicants were women, and there was a significant increase in numbers applying across a range of ethnic backgrounds. I think at 30%, the existing proportion of women in the force, it's already ahead of many other countries. However, we still have a long way to go to ensure that our police service reflects the full diversity of the communities it serves. As our population expands with new Irish communities and other minority groups, my hope is that every person living in Ireland will see themselves reflected in the members of An Garda Síochána that they meet on their local roads and in their local Garda stations. Of course, we want a policing service that is diverse not only in gender and ethnicity, but also in socio-economic, educational and geographical background. As you may be aware, last November, An Garda Síochána launched the first Garda Diversity Internship, the first of its kind, an initiative for An Garda Síochána. The internship aims to increase the accessibility, the understanding of, and indeed the potential for a career in An Garda Síochána for school leavers and graduates, particularly those from groups that would typically be underrepresented in the organisation. There are currently 29 interns employed across the programme on a full-time, a short-term basis, 13 third-level graduates and 15 recent school leavers. Visible policing is key to helping people feel and be safe in their communities, and a diverse and inclusive policing service affords that feeling of safety and well-being to all of us. Before I finish, I'd like to once again thank Fulbright and the Policing Authority for organising this event and for opening up the discussion around the importance of diverse and inclusive policing, and of course for inviting me to speak to you all today. I really hope you enjoy what is sure to be an enlightening and a fruitful panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Minister McEntee. Our next speaker is Ms. Marianne Doyle. Ms. Doyle is currently Senior Strategic Transformation Manager with An Garda Síochána and a board member of the Irish Fulbright Commission. She previously worked in higher education for over a decade. She is a member of a transnational research group consisting of academics, NGOs, and police service representatives, with her focus on policing, training, and reform.
Thank you very much, Sinead, and thank you, Minister. I am very proud to say I am one of the graduates of the human rights course the Minister spoke of, and I'm honoured now to be a human rights champion in An Garda Síochána, where I work in the area of strategic transformation. Today, however, I welcome you to this online event as a board member of the Irish Fulbright Commission. For those of you joining us today, let me give you some background about the Fulbright programme. The Fulbright programme was set up by Senator J. William Fulbright in 1946 after the devastation of the Second World War, and is now the largest US international exchange programme in the world. It offers students, scholars, and professionals the opportunity to undertake postgraduate study, research, and teaching in 155 countries worldwide. In Ireland, the Fulbright programme was established in 1957 and is a bilateral partnership supported by the US Department of State and the Irish Government's Department of Foreign Affairs. The vision of the Commission is to inspire minds to create a global culture of understanding and solidarity by nurturing academic and professional excellence, expertise, and leadership. Today's event, entitled Towards Diverse and Inclusive Policing, Practitioners and Researchers in Conversation, is co-supported by the Irish Fulbright Alumni Association and the Policing Authority. The Irish Fulbright Alumni Association supports the Fulbright programme and plays a key role in befriending and supporting American Fulbrighters in Ireland, and it organises a range of educational programmes and social events for its members and for visiting American Fulbrighters. The Policing Authority is a statutory agency in Ireland with the mission to hold An Garda Síochána fairly and transparently to account in the interests of all, particularly the most vulnerable, with the vision of an ethical, effective, human rights-based policing service that merits and enjoys the confidence of the increasingly diverse people it serves. Sincere thanks to all involved in today's discussion on such an important and timely topic, particularly the esteemed speakers and the steering committee comprised of representatives from the Irish Fulbright Alumni Association, the Irish Fulbright Commission, the Policing Authority, and An Garda Síochána. There's one person specifically responsible for making this happen and for having the idea in the first place, and that is Dr Aoife Delaney, who is the Communications Officer of the Irish Fulbright Alumni Association and a Research Manager with the Policing Authority. Senator Fulbright said, "The greatest strength and enduring value of the Fulbright programme has been its ability to work patiently and persistently to build human networks around the globe. Today is a great example of building a human network. We have people registered to attend today from organisations such as policing services, from universities and research organisations, from non-governmental organisations and grassroots organisations, from governments, from interest groups, and from private industry on both sides of the Atlantic and beyond. Today, we're having a conversation with mutual respect for all in that spirit, and you are all very welcome. We live in a complex and changing world. We have endured a pandemic that impacted the way all of us live and work, and in some tragic cases, how our loved ones died and were mourned. The pandemic also altered, to a certain extent, the societal contract with policing organisations, with emergency laws and new methods of policing. Whilst war is not new, nor in one isolated area, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has highlighted a threat to democratic systems and changed the world order as we watch suffering and mass migration. Societal changes impact policing, and policing impact societal changes. Policing is an integral part of everyone's lives. Sometimes that is invisible, and sometimes that is evident. Today, we'll be predominantly focused on policing in democracies, yet every recognised country has some form of law enforcement as part of the administration. Note that we are saying policing rather than police, as policing as an action and policing as a profession is carried out by a diverse range of people and in diverse ways around the globe. There are communities who are engaged with policing services, and there are communities who self-police. Around the world, there are very many different models of policing. The Republic of Ireland has a national police and security agency that is predominantly unarmed. And in the USA, there are over 17,000 policing and law enforcement agencies. The civilianization of policing, volunteer police, private policing, and other policing models are included in this conversation. Diversity and inclusion are imperative topics in all aspects of our lives and work. Within organizations such as policing, as with other sectors, it has been proven that people from diverse backgrounds lead to improved and more accurate thinking. Diverse teams are more likely to become aware of biases and make better and more accurate decisions. As the oft-cited adage goes, diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. As Angela Workman-Stark writes in her book, Inclusive Policing from the Inside Out, inclusion may also be thought of as the degree to which employees perceive they can fully contribute to the organisation. It represents the sharing of ideas from all perspectives, and it involves people working together towards a shared objective despite their differences, and the creation of an internal climate where differences of thought and opinion are valued and embraced. Embracing diversity and striving for inclusion for all is a core mission of the Fulbright programme. With network serving all and actions such as ensuring all involved in selection processes receive unconscious bias training. I've undertaken this myself. In democracies, communities trusting the police is a core tenet of this relationship and the basis for policing by consent. Sir Robert Peel's foundational policing principles of 1829 include reference to this throughout. For example, to recognise always that the power of the police to fulfil their functions and duties is dependent on public approval of their existence, actions, and behaviour, and on their ability to secure and maintain public respect. Also, that the police and the community are indeed the one group, to maintain at all times a relationship with the public that gives reality to the historic tradition that the police are the public and the public are the police. As those being served by the police are diverse in this globalised and changing world, having a diverse and inclusive police service is a key facet of police legitimacy and public approval, serving without fear or favour. Policing organisations have broad and essential responsibilities and remits, as demonstrated at a high level by their mottos. LAPD advocates to protect and to serve. Minneapolis Policing Department, to protect with courage, to serve with compassion. And both services on the island of Ireland serve to keep people safe. The conversations we will hear and be part of today will delve into this crucial topic of policing to serve, protect, and keep people safe with values of diversity, inclusion, both inside policing organisations and as we explore the drivers of change relating to diversity and inclusion in this area: society, justice, and police. As Senator Fulbright said, we must dare to think unthinkable thoughts. We must learn to explore all the options and possibilities that confront us in a complex and rapidly changing world. We must learn to welcome and not to fear the voices of dissent. We must dare to think unthinkable things, because when things become unthinkable, thinking stops and action becomes mindless. It is with the essence of this thought that we progress into the panel discussions. We will discuss complex issues and welcome differing thoughts with mutual respect as we move towards diverse and inclusive policing. Thank you all for joining us, and you are all very, very welcome.
Marianne, thank you so much for your introduction to the Fulbright programme in Ireland and to today's sessions. It is now time for our first panel. What does inclusive policing look like? And I would like to ask our panelists to take Marianne's example and take their time so that the interpreters are able to keep up with the speed of speech. Unfortunately, I don't think I did a very good example of that at the start. Our first panel, What Does Inclusive Policing Look Like?, is chaired by Professor Steve Morial. For our attendees and participants, please remember to add your questions and comments to the panel through the Q&A feature rather than the chat window during this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Sinead. Hello, everybody. I'm Steve Morielli. I'm coming to you from the United States. I am a Fulbrighter, as I am now called. I had the pleasure of serving with UL Law and the Garda, and spent a great deal of time in Garda College in Temple Moor. This is about human rights. We've got 4 panelists today that will focus on what inclusive policing looks like. We have Paul Franey, Donnell Fitzpatrick, Siobhan McKenna, and Margaret Tumulty, who will talk about their points of view. One of the things is I was thinking as we're writing is this shows such great leadership and foresight. This is an event that is so important, and it is being talked about in virtually every English-speaking country that I am familiar with. I spent a lot of time interviewing people, and including Canada, US, New Zealand, Northern Ireland, Australia, and Ireland itself, and everyone is focusing on what's going on. I think many of us should be looking, as we do in the United States, about what our biases are. What are our lived experiences? And what I find in the classroom is that when I open the conversation with a group of people, and I'm at Worcester State University, and it's an extremely diverse population, when you begin to ask about lived experiences from people who have come from all over the world, in Worcester alone, 79 different languages are spoken. And so beginning to understand what they've been through helps us understand. And as Kavi said, seek first to understand and then be understood. So we need to listen to understand. And it's with great pleasure to get this kicked off. Our first panelist is Superintendent Paul Franey. He's a superintendent for An Garda Síochána in the North County of Dublin. He is focused on providing police service delivery in that area. Superintendent Franey, Paul was formerly in charge of the Garda Strategic Policing Unit. He's the former secretary and founder of G-Force, the Garda LGBT Employee Network, and a former vice president of the European LGBT Police Association. He's designed and delivered training to police officers from across the EU on hate crime and LGBT policing issues on behalf of the Council of Europe. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome Paul. He'll speak for a few minutes and then we'll pose some questions, and feel free to throw some questions in the Q&A. Good morning to you, Superintendent.
Good morning, Steve. And thanks to the Policing Authority in Fulbright for inviting me to talk here today. I'll start my little 7-minute timer and I'll slow down. Yeah, policing and diversity and what it means to me, well, it probably means something very different today than it did when I walked through the gates of Tethelmore 22 years ago. And I remember friends telling me outside the UCD, at the UCD bus stop on the Slurgan dual carriageway, you've no business joining the police, you know, a gay lad like you, and that it's not a world for people like you. And they meant it as far as they were concerned. That's just not for you. I thought that was madness, and I just joined the Guards, and that was that. And very quickly I realized, actually, yeah, there's something going on here, and this isn't comfortable at all. And I've done LGBT work, sort of worked for NGOs since I was about 16, and I decided I'm joining the Guards, and that's it. No more diversity stuff. I'm there to be a policeman. That's that. And I think it took 3 years to find a second gay police officer. And I think, you know, to find 2 or 3 more took 2 or 3 more years. And I realized there's something serious going on here culturally. If all of these people are hidden and we can't see each other. And look, that led to me getting involved in the European Gay Police Association, setting up an LGBT employee network many, many years before government departments, etc. Like 2019, I was flat out being invited to launches of government LGBT networks. You know, we did it in 2007 when it wasn't popular, wasn't comfortable, and it was a battle and it was unkind. And that'll look back at the end towards, you know, when we talk about diversity in the police and it being management's job to manage, and representation is hugely important. But we have to be very careful when we recruit small numbers of people from diverse backgrounds to make sure we support them so they don't end up carrying the weight of the organization's change journey, which is what happened to a small group of LGBT guards 15, 20 years ago. And then things sort of changed, you know, sort of a career went on, and suddenly I'm a superintendent in Balbriggan. Last census, Ireland's youngest town, Ireland's fastest growing town, and one of Ireland's most diverse towns. And a town with a lot of challenges. And within a few weeks of me arriving, we had a Black Lives Matter protest at the front gates of the Guard station, as a result of an incident in Blanchardstown. And I saw a group of people standing there, really, really angry at the police. A lot of anger, I think fear, and I could see pain in people's faces. And they looked at us and they didn't see a police service that represented them. We were all as pale as I am, you know, and I'm as pasty white as it gets. And I thought, well, you know, we're community-based police service. We're, you know, this is what we do. We're not like, excuse my American friends, we're not like, you know, we don't carry guns, it's routine. We're community-based. You know, I always thought we're different. And I said, okay, there's something going on here. And that set the trajectory of my time, and I suppose my priority work in Balbriggan since I've arrived. And me thinking when I arrived out here, because I have a diversity background, I know what I'm talking about. And I quickly realized I didn't know what I was talking about at all. I didn't know what it was like for a young Black person growing up in Ireland. I didn't understand the fears their parents had for them and their futures. And I quickly learned the best thing to do is shut up and listen. Shut up and listen. And then when you're finished that, shut up and listen, because you don't understand. And that's okay. It's okay not to understand, and to put your hand up and say, I don't fully get this. And the last 18 months has been a journey around that, of realizing the very real fear that some people have around policing. The fact that there's a lot of people in this town who don't have that intergenerational relationship with policing. They didn't grow up with guards as neighbors. Their friends in schools, parents weren't guards. They don't have that link. Their parents often come from countries where policing is not a good job, not respected people, not well trained, human rights, not even on the cards. You know, and people have carried that fear with them. And then to manage policing in a highly politicized relationship at this stage with the international Black Lives Matter movement, you know, policing and race, very highly sensitive topic. And there's lots of fears there, there's lots of complexity, very difficult to have, I suppose, nuanced, complex conversations in a world where everyone sort of communicates via Twitter and social media, firing off opinions, you know, or in something that's really complex. And I suppose one of the last key things is that, for me, that struck me as the legitimacy challenge we face. The people out there don't see people that look like them in this uniform. They don't see a policing service that represents them. And while I'm glad we have increased the amount of applicants coming through in the most recent competition, there's a huge amount more to be done before people can look at a Garda Síochána and say, yeah, you look like us, we look like you. You have a chance of understanding where we're coming from. And you know, that to me is one of the, you know, the biggest challenges we face, getting people in who represent communities, but supporting them while they're in there. You know, having had to, I suppose, as a very young Garda sergeant, do management's job for them. I don't want young Black men and women to have to do what we had to do all those years ago. That would be wrong. So now, as I sit here today wearing a white shirt, it's my job to take the hit. It's my job to do the difficult work. It is not the job of the small number of Black guards that we're likely to recruit in the coming period to take that hit, and they'll need to be supported while they're here. So look, I'm where my 7 minutes is up, so I'll stop with that, but hopefully that's been helpful, and I'll answer any questions.
Very helpful. Thank you, Paul. And one of the things that I'm hearing you say too, and it is to pay attention as they enter, to spend some time to understand and help them assimilate into the organization, which is really not an easy thing to do, but an important thing to do. And Paul, I'm not sure that we're not at a different point, because just simply talking about this today can be very valuable. So thank you. I'm going to pose one question. I don't want an answer. I want you to think about it. But what stakeholders outside of AGS can assist in the provision of a more inclusive policing service? And when we get back, we'll talk about that. So next up, thank you so much. I'd clap for you and ask the audience to clap, but you know that's not possible. So up next is Dr. Donald Patrick. Donald Patrick is currently Senior Design ICT Advisor for the Center for Excellence in Universal Design at the National Disability Authority. Donald has 20 years experience in academia and is an advocate for accessibility for persons with disabilities. He has extensive experience in both research and teaching activities in the areas of web tech, user experience, and interaction design, as well as software development. He is previously a Fulbright visiting scholar and spent time at Florida State University back in the early 2000s. So for me, it's good morning, but for everyone else, it's good afternoon. Donald, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and I would echo Superintendent Franey by saying thank you for the invitation. I do just want to clarify one point before I start, if I may, that the views expressed here today are drawing on some material produced and provided by my employer, but the views are mine and do not necessarily reflect those of my employer. And I'll just digress for a quick 10 seconds to say that by sheer coincidence, Paul mentioned that he is superintendent in Balbriggan. I'm also talking to you from the town of Balbriggan in North County Dublin by sheer coincidence. I'm going to talk to you today about what I would consider to be important in terms of policing and persons with disabilities. Unlike many people on the various panels today, I am not an expert in this domain. I speak from the perspective of somebody who has, as the chair rightly pointed out, extensive experience in research and the practicalities in relation to accessibility. I also speak from the perspective of lived experience. I am totally blind and have been since birth. So my experience and my comments today are predicated on the work that I have done in the field of accessibility and also my own lived experience. Underpinning everything really that we do is the fact that Ireland ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the UNCRPD, in 2018. The overarching vision for the UNCRPD, which entered into force on the 19th of April 2018, is to ensure that persons with disabilities can participate and contribute to society on an equal basis with others. The first state report was submitted to Geneva in November 2021. Now, several UNCRPD articles are relevant to the equal access to justice and I guess to policing. Article 13, okay, is access to justice. And it's very, very important that this is treated with equality, irrespective of disability or not. Article 5, equality and non-discrimination. Article 9, accessibility generally. And Article 12, equal recognition before the law. So my take on this is, and I do speak as a non-expert, that policing must be cognizant of and reflect these articles as we go forward. Now, to do this, what I think is very important is communication. Okay, with communication comes the capacity to engage with people. So what does communication entail? It entails giving people the facility to engage in information trading, is the best way I can describe it. What that means is that policing must be cognizant of the different needs of people with disabilities to communicate in different ways. Technology, which is my own background, can play an important role in this, but no matter what we do with technology, there is also the human factor. Let me give you some examples. When communicating, it's important to use the correct language. Indeed, I would refer anybody interested to the communications toolkit, which has been developed by the Centre for Excellence in Universal Design and is available on the website universaldesign.ie. It's also very important that not only that the right language is used, but that the right approach is taken. That, for example, and I'll refer to myself here, if I approach a Garda for assistance to cross the road, they know how to address me. They know how to guide me, for example, across a road. If I go in to the Garda station to complete a passport application, that the Garda with whom I deal knows how to guide me physically, and again, using the right words, in the appropriate way to actually sign that form. Communication is so important. And it is particularly important because, as we know, people with disabilities are overrepresented in the criminal justice system. And as such, ensuring that people have the right access to appropriate guidance, advice, and communication is crucial. If we take the built environment, the accessibility of the built environment, again, is very, very important. For example, are all buildings designed in such a way that somebody who uses a wheelchair can get into them and out of them easily? Are the counters at a sufficient height that will enable, we're back to communication again, communication. That again is as much as I will say on that. Technology. All public bodies have a legal right now, a legal obligation now to ensure that their websites are accessible. That's pursuant to the Web Accessibility Directive, which came into force in Ireland in 2020. A very interesting one is that in June 2022, the European Accessibility Act, which is currently undergoing transposition activities, will hopefully be transposed and will come into force in 2025. This has some interesting clauses in respect of answering of the European emergency number 112 in respect of ensuring their maximal accessibility. So for me, I think the importance of diverse policing, of equal access to policing, comes back to communication and accessibility, ensuring that the right communication strategies and methodologies are in place, that the human factor is not supplanted by technology, but is enhanced by technology. Because without the human factor, technology is and can be very, very sterile. We must ensure, in my view, that everything is underpinned by a good communication strategy and an understanding of the right ways to facilitate interaction and with members of An Garda Síochána and other policing agencies and persons with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Donal, very much. One of the things that strikes me is you were talking about communication and listening. We've heard that completely. I just finished a class with a young man who was brilliant, but he was in a wheelchair and a quadriplegic. And the students felt very uncomfortable at first. And I asked him, could we talk about what put him in that chair and how he has functioned and what the difficulties are, just getting up an elevator, as you suggested. And I can tell you, the moment I had that conversation with the students, it just broke down all of the barriers. He was appreciative. The students were appreciative. They were welcoming. And I think this thing called communication and not being fearful of confronting differences can really make the world go round, because policing, after all, is all about relationships. So we're going to move on, and we have another. So thank you, Donal, very much. Appreciate your perspective. Right up next is Siobhan McKenna. Siobhan is the head of Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion at the Public Appointments Service. The Public Appointments Service in Ireland is the centralized recruiter for civil and public sector in Ireland. Prior to this role, Ms. McKenna spent 20 years in London, during which time she developed and delivered the Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion workplace priorities for the Mayor of London. Between 2019 and 2021, Ms. McKenna established and led the £7 million education program. I had to figure out what that said, Siobhan. We don't see the pound sign very often here in the States. The £7 million education program at the UK's first ever violence reduction unit. Ms. McKenna holds a bachelor's degree in social science from UCD and a master's in ethnic and racial studies from Trinity College. And we welcome you. Hello.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me and see me okay? Excellent. Thanks for that introduction, Steve. And my thanks to Fulbright and the Policing Authority again for inviting me along today. I was a bit of a late addition to the panel, but I jumped at the chance when Aoife contacted me. Just a little bit about myself before I get into, I think, why I'm on the panel. As Steve was saying, I've spent the last, up until 2021, when I moved back to Dublin with my family, I spent 20 years in the UK, initially in international development, working on the fight against the global AIDS pandemic. And then I moved more into domestic work, and I worked for the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, for 7 years, and then Sadiq Khan for 5. Markedly different experiences there, let me tell you, particularly in the ED&I space. And most of my time, I initially started there developing European social funded projects for disadvantaged young Londoners to help them get into or stay into education, employment and training. Disadvantaged young Londoners is code for Black and brown young Londoners, I realized very quickly. And so there has always been an element of ED&I in the work that I've done. I moved on then to advise the Mayor on social policy around child poverty, things like that in London. And then, as Steve pointed out, which might be of interest to the audience today, I led the education programme in the UK's first ever violence reduction unit. Many of you will be aware that there is a chronic problem with youth violence on the streets of London. It is limiting and destroying young lives in every one of the 33 boroughs there. Sadiq Khan, the current Mayor of London, grew up on a council estate in South London. Some of his friends went this way, other friends went the other way. He had that lived experience and he knows what youth violence and crime can do. So he set up the violence reduction unit and I led the education programme there. And that was mainly working with schools and further education colleges to try and keep kids who were kicked out of mainstream schools into what they call pupil referral units. So try and keep them engaged in education and show them that there is a different pathway, despite what the lived experience of most of their family, their extended networks, their friends, their classmates, what they witnessed with their own eyes on the streets of London. We tried to convince them that there was an alternative, and that alternative needed to include education and training. And so I spent a couple of years there doing that. The Brexit happened, and between Brexit and actually doing that job in the violence reduction unit, I really got a sense that things in the 20 years that I'd spent in London, things had got worse. And that is quite an admission to make, particularly when you're working for 20 years to try and make things better. However, lots of it was outside of my control. And so we returned to Dublin and I took up the role of ED&I at the Public Appointment Service. And just before I get on to some of the work that we're doing there, when I joined the Violence Reduction Unit, I had the pleasure of working with many colleagues across the Metropolitan Police who work to reduce violent crime among young Londoners, violent crime in general. The Met Police, I watched over the 20 years that I was in London, there seemed to be a near complete breakdown of community policing in London. And that is not just for ethnic minority, young Black and brown men. I was at the vigil for Sarah Everard, the woman who was murdered by the Met Police officer last summer, and I witnessed how the Met Police handled peaceful women who were demonstrating about the violent murder of that woman. The LGBT community, I know, have lost confidence in bits of the Met Police to address their needs and to understand the threat that is still out there on the streets of London. Unbelievably, disability hate crime was on the rise when I was leaving, both online, offline, in real life violence, in terms of violence as well. I also lived through the riots in 2011, if you remember them, where it felt like London was on fire. And it felt like the Met Police, at the time, I felt like the Met Police had totally lost control of London. That's a city of 8 million people. as we watched it kick off in one end of London, and then 20 minutes later, there was a furniture shop burning in Croydon. Half an hour later, Wandsworth it was a startling thing to live through. When I arrived in the violence reduction unit, my direct line manager had been the borough commander for Hackney for 20 years. So he was a proper copper and he completely changed my views of police in London. But, he freely admitted that summer 2021, there was such a dearth of community contacts and connections that the police genuinely lost control of pockets of London. And I found that quite an honest and startling admission from someone who'd been in the police force for nearly 30 years. I have also, you can't help, I remember where I was when I heard that Stephen Lawrence had been murdered. I was the same age as him, and I will never forget that day. And obviously, like many others, we watched in horror as all of that unfolded, and the people who were responsible for his murder have never really been brought to justice, although 2 or 3 of them are in prison. We watched what happened to Stephen Lawrence's family at the hands of the Met Police. And we watched Doreen Lawrence take on some of the most ingrained establishments in the UK. And it'd be very difficult to say that things had got better in the Metropolitan Police Force. The culture of misogyny and homophobia and racism was rife. And it was something that the recently outgoing, or she's gone already, commissioner failed to address. And so things got worse and worse. My greatest fear for Ireland is that we repeat the mistakes that the Met Police have made in policing a super diverse city like London. Ireland is only 5 million, it's much less diverse than London. We have huge opportunities to learn from what our colleagues have experienced. We have a very different history, and we have a very different culture. We don't have 400 years of empire that we've never really dealt with properly on one side. And in the US, we don't have 200 years of slavery and 50 years of Jim Crow to deal with the repercussions and the legacy of that. We're not starting with a clean slate here. Ask any traveler in this country if Irish people are racist, and they will tell you that Irish people were racist long before brown people arrived here. And so I think my fear is that we get policing wrong, and that we end up with communities that were mentioned earlier that police themselves. And we on the island of Ireland know how wrong that can go when communities take on their own policing. So while my day job is trying to make the civil service much more representative of the communities across Ireland, anytime I get in the room with An Garda Síochána colleagues who are working really hard to change things, I have a bee in my bonnet about this, and we really need to get this right. We need to maintain, I think there's good levels of trust between An Garda Síochána and the Irish population in general. But I have no doubt that across various communities, that level of trust goes up and down. So we need to get better. All of the other speakers today have said it, at listening to the lived experience of people who are now coming through the streets and the towns and the villages of this country. What it's like. I was born and raised in this country. I have no doubt that it is harder now to be a person of colour in Ireland than it was in the 70s and 80s and 90s when I was growing up. Absolutely no doubt in my mind. They're simply because of the numbers and the diversity of it. I was a bit of a unicorn when I was growing up. There was no one else of colour around me. It was a bit of a novelty. I certainly wasn't a threat. And I could see it now. And I talk to young people coming through, and I talk to migrants who've been in this country for 20 years. And there is no doubt that their lived experience is harder than mine. I think it is probably something that we need to go through. Ireland has changed hugely in the 20 years that I was out of it, largely for the best, I have to say. And certainly looking on from afar in the UK, as I was watching that disintegrate into chaos, Ireland was looking a lot more progressive across the board. So my husband and my kids, we all moved back here, where we, to a country that we thought maybe had a chance in the near to medium future. And we are working really hard to make that difference. So in the public appointments service, we've identified a lot of areas that we need to do better on. There are some real structural barriers to people joining the public and civil service. Stuff around citizenship, for example, for people from migrant backgrounds, education qualifications for other people who may not have finished their education but have had 10 years of work experience in the workplace, but they can't get through our processes because they don't have a passing grade in the Leaving Cert. We need to get better at our processes. We need to take them into the 21st century. And we are doing a lot of work around that. There's a dearth of data at the moment out there. We don't really know who's joining and who isn't. So we're doing a big piece of work with the ERSI at the moment, and they're crunching through, I think, about 300,000 pieces of data for us, because about 60 to 80,000 people a year apply to join the public sector in Ireland through the Public Appointment Service. So we have a huge amount of data. We just need to look at it properly, put it together and see who is joining the civil service, who isn't joining the civil service, and what we can do to remove the barriers. We do about 60% of the recruitment for An Garda Síochána, somewhere between 60 and 70. So we understand that we need to get that diversity of candidate coming through our processes. While we're a recruitment organization, and effectively our job stops when we assign candidates and hand them over to various departments and organizations, we have a moral obligation to understand that the environment that we're assigning candidates to is not hostile to their disability or their sexual orientation or their gender identity or their ethnic background. So we are part of this process. We are part of the puzzle. We are part of this chain, and we are acutely conscious of our role. And I'll stop there because I know we're going to have more Q&A later. So just again, it's really great to be here. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And Siobhan, you sharing that statement that you think it's worse now than it was in 70s and 80s is chilling, because I think we're supposed to advance as a society. One of the things that I would say, so thank you. One of the things I will propose later is, how do we improve recruiting? How do we do better outreach? And who belongs at the table to try to figure that out? Policing is complicated, as we all know, and inclusion is very, very important. I just came back from UL, and I was happy to work with Garda and Policing Authority on a mental health, putting mental health clinicians in cars on a pilot program in Limerick, and that is moving forward. And that comes out of the report. Kathy O'Toole, I know, is listening, and she was the chair of the Future of Policing. And obviously some of this work comes out of it. So thank you. We'll be looking for your input on that and others. So thank you to Siobhan. Appreciate it, and we'll move on. Our last panelist on this particular panel is Margaret Tumulty. She's the Director of Policing Strategy and Performance at the Policing Authority, and that was established in January of 2016. The Policing Authority is intended to oversee the performance of AGS in delivering police services, and she has 20 years experience in oversight roles, including with the Broadcasting Authority in Ireland, and a background in NGO and community development. She holds a BA in communication from DCU and an MSc in organizational behavior from TCD, and currently working on her doctorate in governance at IPA. You know, I wasn't sure whether that was a beer, but anyway, I welcome Margaret. Thank you very much. You have the floor. Can't hear you. Can't hear you. Not yet. Nope. No, I don't hear you. No, we're still not hearing you.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Mark's just running in to help you there, Margaret.
Here he comes. Help is on the way. So the other thing, while you're listening, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. We will try to address as many now or even afterwards, because I think it's very important that your questions, your comments, your feelings, your input can be very valuable to the Policing Authority and Fulbright. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for any of you do. The other thing, while we're waiting, Margaret, are you on? Oh, not yet. How do we get the attention of senior management at Garda, among others, and find a chance to have some attention? It already does have some attention, but how do we move this forward? How do we move the needle? As we're waiting for Margaret, she probably moved. That's what I think is happening. So please, everybody, stand by. Some of the questions that we'll be throwing at the panel afterwards is, what does a diverse and inclusive police service mean to you? Are you on, Margaret?
Yes.
You are? Okay, I can't see.
Almost.
Okay. Well, we can hear you, so you've got it.
So, yeah. So thank you, and apologies for the short delay there. So I suppose in considering the what I was going to say today, somebody said earlier about not being an expert. I'm certainly not an expert, but what we have done is a lot of listening. And I suppose I'm going to base my remarks today on what we would have heard from various communities that we've listened to over the last number of years. So in terms of an inclusive police service, I suppose we take that word inclusive, or to be included, I suppose it's about, firstly, am I included in the community that the police service has committed to serve and to protect and to keep safe? And do I believe myself to be included in that community? A second would be then, I suppose, as evidence of that, do I feel included in terms of the way that that police service distributes its resources, in how it responds? Do I believe that my safety is important? Do I believe that there's an appropriate balance between my being protected and my being policed? Thirdly, do I believe that I'm included in terms of the standards, the professionalism, the sense of service that's provided to me from that police service? Am I deserving of these standards? Am I included in that community that's entitled to those standards? And that's in my role as a victim, in my role as a suspect, in my role as a witness. And that's in terms of the type of language that's used about me within that police service, the type of language that's used to me, the courtesy, the empathy, the humanity of the response that I get, the timeliness of the service that's provided to me, and also the credibility of my crisis. So when I approach the police service, do I believe that I have credibility in front of them in all of those roles? And then also in terms of inclusion in the workforce, are there people like me there? And that's more than a nice to have. It's about, do I believe there's people in the police service that have a notion of what my reality is and understand me and where I come from and can meet me where I am? And I think that's not just about, you know, getting into work in the organisation, but then when I'm in the organisation, am I included culturally in that organisation? Can I be my authentic self? Do I have to become less me and more like ye? And then also when I'm there, can I just go in and be a guard, or do I have to have a dual responsibility where I'm a guard, but I'm also carrying a burden of having to change your minds and win your hearts, and also, you know, carry expectations of my own community into that role as well? Or can I just go in and be a guard? And I suppose you could argue, look, you know, diversity isn't every organisation struggling with diversity in all big organisations. But the guards, the police service is a totally different animal. It has extraordinary powers. And so there's more critical implications for my not being included, either in terms of the community it serves or in that organisation. They have, you know, huge powers. If I'm not included, it has implications for my safety, for my sense of my own safety. If there's discriminatory use of those powers, you know, is that use of force, is it coercion? So diversity and inclusion is of a whole other order when talking about it within a police service, as opposed to maybe other parts of other types of services that we receive. And I suppose just then to maybe talk a little about some of the vignettes that we would have been given when we do listen to people. So going back to the idea, am I included in the community? When we were doing our oversight of COVID policing during COVID, I remember one traveller woman talking about what was for her an extraordinary moment, which was rocking up to a checkpoint, putting down the window and being asked, you know, where are you going? And saying, well, we're going to Duns. And being told, right, so on you go. And for her, she spoke quite, you know, movingly about it. She said, you know, this was the first time that I felt I was just one of the community. I wasn't stopped. We weren't asked for tax insurance. We weren't asked to get out of the van. It was, I was there and they were asking me the same questions as everybody else, and I just proceeded on my day. And she talked about that with huge resonance. In terms of that idea of, am I included in terms of how the police service distribute their resources? You know, we would have heard from, you know, particular socioeconomic groups that would have talked about their perception that, you know, policing is about a policy of containment, and it's okay if the drug dealer's on the end of my road, but they won't let the drug dealer be seen on that other road because that population wouldn't put up with it, politicians wouldn't like it, but it's okay for us to have to put up with that on our road because we're not included in the community that merits that type of protection and safety and quality of life to be afforded to them. Equally, we would have talked to travellers who would have said, you know, when crimes are committed on a halting site or between travellers, we don't believe the response is the same, and that there's a greater tolerance. That entitlement of service, you know, and courtesy and language. You would have talked to young offenders who, you know, don't believe that it exists for them. We would have talked to young black men who would have said that, you know, this goes back to their point about there aren't people like me in the police service. They would have said, you know, my volume, the volume of my voice, the way I gesture, you know, I'm continually told to calm down. And the way I talk is seen as aggressive. And, you know, they would have talked about that. And also then we would have talked to people as well about how it can be a cold place within the workforce. And that talked about the importance of language. But one of the things I suppose that comes across has been in terms of inclusion, diversity, and the idea of getting more people into the Garda workforce is that it's not about HR campaigns, it's not about recruitment campaigns, that it's how I experience policing of an Anonymous Wednesday in my own interactions is the critical factor that will influence whether and how I would conceive of going to be a guard, or would encourage any of my mates to go and be a guard. And that really, that interaction, those teachable moments, that they are the moments that determine very often the credibility, or that many parts of the community, whether they believe a police service is for them, and is going to offer them that protection. I suppose just two other small points. I often think when I hear people talk about diversity, it's a bit like the way people talk about breastfeeding. You know, breast is best. There's none of us are our best every day of the week. And I think as long as we keep seeing diversity as a PC thing and a nice thing to have and an added extra, there is no imperative to challenge ourselves to have it on a day-to-day basis. And I think for me, I suppose a question I'd love to hear today is whether we think there's yet a policing imperative for diversity, or does the organisation, the Garda Síochána organisation, believe there is a policing imperative, or is the imperative still coming from outside? This is what you should do. You should be diverse because that's what people say is a good thing. Or is there, if you were to ask an ordinary guard of any day of the week, would they be able to articulate, well, no, from a police point of view, this is why it's important. And I think there's a felt need is often an important thing to have when you want to affect change. And I suppose I'd wonder to what degree that felt need is there. The policy intent undoubtedly is there, but at a very ordinary frontline police officer need, has that been thought about or understood as yet? What is that policing imperative? So I leave it there, and apologies again for the technical issues at the start. Thank you.
Margaret, you bounced back very well. Thank you very much. And what you just said, I think, is really important. Is it driven through the organization yet? It probably isn't. It needs to move forward. And I can say that we have the same experience on the university campuses, probably worldwide, that students are looking for teachers who are similar in their backgrounds. And so this is not just a matter for police concern, but it's a matter for just employment overall. So we need to do a better job of mentoring people. I hearken back to my days in the military back in the 70s. And, you know, here I am from a relatively homogeneous group of people where I went to school. And I saw for the first time tremendous diversity. And yet, while there was misunderstanding at first, the person to my right or my left in the military, they were going to save my butt, and vice versa. So we begin to, when we mix people together and listen and understand, and that's the common theme I'm hearing. This is the question and answer period now. And then we're going to take a break at 10:20. We've only got a few more minutes, about 10 minutes, but I'm going to start with Paul. The question that I posed you, I gave you a little bit of lead time on that, Paul. What do you think of that particular question? What stakeholders outside of the Garda can assist in providing a diverse and inclusive police service?
Look, I think there's a multitude of stakeholders there, and I think probably traditionally we thought we'd less than we had, and I suppose as an organisation we may have in the past gone to the stakeholders that made us feel safe, and there's that balance between sort of needing a critical friend and having someone that's not so critical you can't have a conversation, but it needs to be in that critical zone where, you know, traditionally, like there's groups we would have engaged with in the past who would have been very conservative, and now, like, we have, say, a group of parents in Balbriggan who sort of formed a collective, for want of a better word. And like, you know, there's no holding back. They'll tell us exactly what they think, and if they're not happy, they're not happy. And that's actually great. And they're not doing it to have a row, they're not doing it to be difficult. They're doing it because we need to understand better, and they want what's best for their kids. Whereas more traditional stakeholders, maybe from more traditional backgrounds, would have been very pro-police and very pro sort of a very formal, sort of serious way of dealing with people. And it's difficult. Like, there needs to be a little bit of a balance, but we can't be going to the safe spaces. So like, there are going to be great support from academia. We do well in the moment in a big piece of work with us in and around our relationship with sort of Black Irish young people in Balbriggan. And that's, I know that's going to throw up a lot of challenging stuff, but if we don't do it, this doesn't move forward, you know. And giving, I think the one thing that struck me the last year and a half actually is the importance of giving a voice to young people. We kind of think because people are under 18, their voice isn't as valuable. You know, and look, we can all remember we were 18 and, you know, our voices were very different, but still what we had to say had value and opportunities for young people to actually articulate what's going on for them. You know, they're the people we engage with the most. Sorry, I'll slow down. You know, that's a really important group of people that we actually, and they are the future that, you know, we need to actually be part of that shut up and listen game, and give them something that gives them an opportunity maybe to educate us a bit. And you're on mute there.
I should know better. A couple of questions came in, and one of them had to do with surveillance technologies and the impact on trust and relationships. And with the rise in body-worn cameras that may be coming to the Garda, and certainly a cell phone in everybody's hand, and the almost the instant desire to tape any interaction between police in a gotcha situation. I'm gonna stick with Paul, and I have a question for Siobhan in a minute, but what's your thought as you have conversations with the Gardaí about that?
The sort of technology's changed everything, and it's interesting. We don't have body-worn cameras at the moment. We're, you know, I
think you will. I think you will.
Well, but like I've said, we'll take the first ones you've got going. The guards who say transfer to Balbriggan from other areas say out here, much more so than where they would have worked beforehand. The video comes out straight away and everything's being recorded. And that's quite different, say, the city centre policing in other suburbs. And that makes policing uncomfortable, but that's where we are. And like, for me, having body-worn cameras is important to protect my own people, because all of a sudden the full interaction from start to finish, and not just a short clip, is being produced. It means that there's complaint, which does happen. All the, you know, what's on social media can be compared with the full extract situation. So when the ombudsman comes in, all of a sudden you have, well, this is what happened according to 5 minutes versus 30 seconds with what might be an emotive caption underneath it, you know. So it's changed the dynamic, I think. But, you know, until we get that tool, we're going to be quite challenged. I know there's human rights concerns on the other side, but I think in terms of balance, I think, you know, to protect my own people, I think it'll be good. To protect the community, I think it'll be good. You know, something has been recorded, people will be professional, complaints will drop. I believe community relationships will improve. So I'm looking forward to them coming out.
Thank you. And so what, you can still hear me, right? All of a sudden, everything flashed here in the United States. I don't know. It must be Russia. So Siobhan, I'm gonna ask you the question that I asked you. How are you working to improve outreach and recruiting to welcome a more inclusive population from saying, give us a try in the public sector?
Yeah, and as I was saying earlier, it is something that we are really conscious of. We have various wheels in motion, I suppose. Just Paul was talking about the young people coming through. Our marketing team has recently developed a 6-module program for that transition year. So that's those 4th year students. They're about 15 or 16, and it is all about careers in the public service. And it's kind of flipping the public and civil service. It's kind of flipping those stereotypes on their head. Like, pen pusher is actually, you know, an EMT with an EpiPen saving someone's life. dog's body is a dog handler at Dublin Port involved in X, you know, so they're trying to broaden and raise awareness of what options are out there in the public service. And that includes the Garda and, you know, all of that. Every single community in Ireland is represented in that year in school, in that transition year, that 15-16 year, because you have to stay in school until that age. So we are really conscious that our pipeline actually starts with those teenagers, and not by the time they're finished school or finished college or looking around. Like, we need to plant the seed there. We also know that you're much more likely to take a public or civil service job if there's a public or civil servant in your family. So we need to reach those people who've never considered a career in the Garda or in the Department for Justice or in HSC. So that is a piece of work to try and cultivate our pipeline a bit. And we've had great success with it. And we ran a competition, and the winner of the competition, I think, was interviewing on Taoiseach yesterday. So it has built up a lot of, it's raised a lot of awareness there, I think. And it went out to all 720 secondary schools in Ireland. So that is one piece that we're doing. I know that we need a community engagement strategy. Like I have articulated it before. If we need to go out to these communities, we need to find out who are the gatekeepers of these communities. And there are always community gatekeepers, people that the community looks up to, respects, trusts, and values. And it's not always the average ones, or it's not always the obvious ones. If we wanted to reach young Black boys in London, we would often go through the network of Black churches, because every neighborhood in London has a Black church to which many families will go to, and it's trusted, it's a safe space, it's secure, you know. So we didn't go to their teachers in school, or because we know you have to find those people who influence those communities. The problem that I have with going, say, to migrant communities to entice them in is that there are real structural barriers around eligibility into the civil service. If you can have a stamp 4 visa, which is an immigration visa, which gives you full rights to work in the state, but in order to join the civil or public sector, you then have to be the parent of, the child of, or the spouse of an EEA national. So you can be a Zimbabwean here on a stamp 4 visa for 25 years, and you can't work for the Irish civil service unless you're married to your partner, or, so there's these kind of anomalies that are a real barrier to going out, say, engaging that particular community. There are other barriers for disabled candidates who want to come through our processes. We like to think our processes are fair and equal and everybody gets the same shot, but we know that diversity tells us that people aren't the same. And actually a process that works for 85% of people isn't good enough if it doesn't work for the other 15%. So we do a lot of work around reasonable accommodations, and we work quite closely with Donald's organization, and they're a great support to us around advice and guidance. There's nothing they don't know about it. And so we are, we've just had a massive review of all our policies and processes with an EDI lens to tell us where these both visible and invisible barriers are to engaging people and bringing them through our processes and making sure that they're successful. Lots of people don't test well. We all know that from school. Lots of people who get straight A's all through the year, and then the stress and the pressure get to them on the day. So like the interview process might not work for people who don't perform like that well under pressure, or are neurodiverse, or whatever that issue that they have is. So we're looking at different ways of testing people's skills. The best predictor of someone doing a job is the fact that they're doing the job already. So, is there a role for kind of in-work assessments for, say, temporary employees who then want to go into a permanent role?
That creates a pretty good feeder system in many cases, and including
saving
interns.
Everyone time, because you're not re-interviewing all these people.
I know, Siobhan, I know we could talk about this forever.
Yep.
There are a few comments, and then we have to take a break so that we can stay on time. But a few comments came, and one of them was from Mary Phelan at DCU, and she asked that the sign language interpreters, Vanessa and Cormac, are trained and qualified now. Not everybody is. What does this mean? And she's concerned about those with disabilities who are brought into police custody into what you call the custody suite, which makes me smile, that they may not understand what the guard is saying to them and whether there are language difficulties. In other words, just addressing that. So I just wanted to raise that. I don't think we can answer that question, but there was also another question about those who have disabilities and whether they're those who are deaf, whether they are whether the Garda is equipped to handle that. And again, what I think Danelle had talked about was about access to police stations all over the country. And some are in better shape than others, and some are a lot older than others, as we know. So I have to wind this down. I apologize that we didn't hear from everybody too long, but this is the time to take a break. And please, within 10 minutes, come on back for more fun and discussion.
Great. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
If you could mute in the meantime, appreciate it. Thank you. Are we in the green room now? Hi, Kathy.
Hello there.
How you doing?
I'm not sure.
Welcome back. We will be starting back in just a moment. I'll give you about 45 seconds to get yourselves settled back in and ready for our second panel discussion. So welcome back. Thank you to Steve and our panelists from the first session. Marianne opened the webinar today by quoting Senator Fulbright, advising us to think unthinkable thoughts. And this resonated really strongly with Paul's invitation to ask uncomfortable questions, questions that might make us uncomfortable, or even questions that might make others uncomfortable, particularly questions that can potentially upset the status quo. Donal reminded us that communication and accessibility are both foundational and fundamentally intertwined in ensuring inclusivity. Both Donal and Siobhan talked about the importance of recognising people's lived experiences, understanding the anger and even the horror that those experiences can create. Siobhan gave us an optimistic and yet realistic call to take advantage of the opportunities we have to create a more inclusive approach to policing in Ireland. Steve reminded us that open communication is key to not being fearful of confronting our differences. And Margaret reiterated the importance of listening to communities, emphasising the centrality of communication in enabling authentic inclusion. And this then very neatly tied back to Paul's experience and concerns about the misplaced onus on minorities to represent their communities and carry the weight of shifting the status quo. Please keep your questions and comments coming for our panelists during this next session through the Q&A feature. And I'd like to now hand over to Ms. Helen Hall, our chair for the second panel session, Society, Justice and Police, Who Drives Change?
Thanks very much, Sinead. And can everybody hear me? I'll just, yeah, I'm seeing nods. I think Steve hasn't joined us yet, but he's not the first up to speak, so I'm sure that'll be resolved. Oh, here he comes. Hi, Steve, how are you doing? So essentially, as Sinead said, we're going to have a panel where we've three people who I'll introduce as they come on. who will say a few words to you and what the panel theme of society, justice and police, who drives change, means to them. And then hopefully we'll have an opportunity then for some Q&A. So keep your Q&A, as Sinead said, coming through on the Q&A line. So we'll start with Miss Kathleen O'Toole, who, for those of you who don't know her, she's a career police officer and lawyer, and she chaired the Commission on the Future of Policing in Ireland. She also served as Chief Inspector in the Garda Síochána Inspectorate, and was a member of the Patent Commission in Northern Ireland, established in 1998 to inquire into policing in Northern Ireland. And I just remembered now, I'm supposed to be speaking slowly, so apologies, Cormac, I'm going to try and do better. Kathleen was also former chief of the Seattle Police Department and previously Boston Police Commissioner. And she earned a BA from Boston College, a JD from New England School of Law, and a PhD at the Business School of Trinity College, Dublin. So Kathleen, over to you. So I think you have about 5 to 7 minutes, and we'll save the questions on the 3 people to the end then. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you very much, Helen. I really appreciate it. It's certainly a privilege to participate today. I often tell my North American friends that I've learned my best lessons on policing on the opposite side of the Atlantic. In Northern Ireland as a member of the Patent Commission, in the Republic of Ireland as the Chief Inspector of the Garda Inspectorate, and then of course most recently as the chair of the Commission on the Future of Policing there. Also, I had the privilege of serving on the Fulbright Ireland USA board when I was working full-time in Ireland, and that was a wonderful experience too. It's great to see so many familiar faces and to engage with many old friends during this call today. I appreciate the opportunity to contribute, but more so, I appreciate the opportunity to learn. I learn more every day, and in this world, particularly around the issue of policing, things are constantly evolving, and it's important that we commit to a strategy of continuous improvement. So before we talk about who drives change, I'd like to just emphasize a few points, some that were discussed earlier. First and foremost, a policing strategy must be built on the strong foundation of human and civil rights. We stated that in our Patent Commission work. We stated that in our work in the Republic of Ireland, and I continue to state it in every policing project I work on here in the US. While each jurisdiction and each police service has its unique characteristics, the principles of democratic policing apply across the board. Second, as discussed in the first panel, a police service must reflect the community it serves, otherwise it will fail. This applies at all ranks, not just sworn ranks, but non-sworn ranks as well. Sometimes when we talk about policing, we tend to focus on those people who are out there on the front lines in uniform. We think of policing in that context. But in many police services, the number of non-sworn people in service has increased dramatically in recent years. In some of the UK services, I hear that it's equal to or above 50%. Here in the United States, it's at approximately 1/3. So we've constantly been increasing the number of non-sworn individuals at all ranks of our police services. When I was out in Seattle as the chief, I arrived, my entire command team of 12 people they were all sworn career police officers. By the time I left, half of them were non-sworn. And among us, we had 4 JDs and 4 PhDs, a former aeronautics engineer, and some incredibly talented and dedicated people who'd spent their careers in policing. And it really brought great diversity of thought to our leadership. And police leadership isn't about one person. It's about creating a team, a diverse team, even at the top of the organization. Third, in policing, particularly in the US, we've done a horrible job of telling the real story of policing. You know, we see these images on TV and it's all about gunfights and car chases, and we watch these TV shows, and I'm sure you see them all on that side of the Atlantic too. When that's not the true picture. In fact, I saw a study recently that indicated that police in the US only spend 4% of their time focused on violent crime. The vast majority of police time is spent responding to calls to assist vulnerable people. And we need to capture that information. We need to tell that story, not only to inform our police operations, but to inform our elected officials, and most important, to inform our community. So the value of technology is really important too. I mean, when I was in Seattle, when I arrived there, we were barely capturing accurate crime stats. And again, that was only a fraction of the work we were actually doing. When we started to capture a broader range of data, and we determined that we were responding to 10,000 people a year who were in serious mental health crisis. So we need that type of information to help inform our police, but also inform our communities so that we can work collectively in multidisciplinary approaches to address the complicated issues police face. I think that the biggest challenges today in policing on both sides of the Atlantic are at the intersection of public health and public safety. And that requires, again, a united effort. Who drives the change? Well, some people expect police leaders to drive the change. In fact, when I first arrived in Ireland, first day at the inspectorate, the Minister of Justice then had a news conference, and people expected me to come in from outside and drive change in policing in Ireland. I remember the first question was, well, you're from America, you'll likely recommend that we arm all the guards, we give them all guns. And I said, absolutely not. I said, that's a wonderful, wonderful tradition here that began at the beginning of the Garda Síochána, when Michael Staines, the first Garda commissioner, said that the guards would serve with moral authority and not with arms. And that's a tradition that I hope will live on for many years to come. So I think that we can't assume that any police leader or any police oversight body is going to make all the decisions. Although senior police leadership, those in oversight positions, elected politicians, they must all provide the support and set the tone for reform and innovation. It must be a collaborative process that involves authentic community engagement. And I believe it should be a grassroots process as well. I'll talk a little bit first about Northern Ireland. When we did the Patent Commission process, I was one who called for robust community engagement. Some thought I was crazy. They said, we can't go out in public meetings and talk about the policing issue in Northern Ireland. It's one of the most contentious issues here. But eventually we took the risk. We had dozens of public meetings. We had hundreds of private meetings with NGOs, with community groups, with individuals. We welcomed written submissions. We heard from as many people as possible. Anyone who wanted a voice in the process had the opportunity to contribute. Similarly, when I was working in the inspectorate, the Garda Inspectorate, our work was informed by members of Garda Síochána at all levels, by government officials. We went out to the public. We had several public meetings on every topic we inspected. We met with private sector organizations, NGOs, and individually with community members and victims as well. So it was just incredibly valuable to get as many perspectives as possible. When I arrived in Seattle on day one, again, the media posed the question, what's your community's policing strategy? What strategy will you implement here? And I said, that depends on the people of Seattle. Seattle's a city of proud neighborhoods. We actually developed a plan where we went out, we divided the city up into 65 to 70 neighborhoods, and we had frontline officers and people living and working in those communities decide what they thought the priorities should be in each one of those neighborhoods. They were the ones who actually drove the change, not the police chief, not the politicians. They were the ones who informed the change in Seattle. Similarly, when we did the commission work in the Republic of Ireland, we replicated the process from Northern Ireland to a large extent with written submissions, welcoming written submissions, public meetings, private group and individual meetings. Anyone who wanted to have a voice in that process had the opportunity to contribute. And we got incredible, valuable contributions in that process. The commission, like in the other instances, then distilled that information and created the findings and recommendations. And those recommendations represent what we heard from the people on the ground, those living and working in the neighborhoods or the communities of Ireland, and those police officers who were working on the front lines as well. It does take leadership to drive the change, to provide the support. And in the Republic of Ireland, the Minister of Justice has done a phenomenal job. And the Taoiseach himself and the Taoiseach's office, there have been a few Taoiseachs during the course of the commission's work, but the government has also been very, very supportive, establishing a body to actually take the recommendations and implement them so that this report would not just sit on a shelf and gather dust. Most of the recommendations in the report have been implemented, and those that have not are underway, from what I understand. So again, it has to be a collaborative process. It has to involve authentic engagement with all stakeholders. And at the end of the day, it has to have the support of government and of police leadership in order to succeed. Thank you.
Thanks very, very much, Kathleen. And there might be a couple of themes coming out of that. I mean, again, you continued that importance of listening and hearing from communities who are being policed. And I think that's something we may return to. And again, that intersection between public health and policing and the real work of policing is something that we might come to in the Q&A part of things. So thank you very, very much. I'm going to invite our next speaker, Yvonne Cook. So Yvonne is the Director of Human Resources in An Garda Síochána Civilian Directorate. She was formerly Head of Human Resources in the PSNI, so she's had experience in this regard in both services. So Yvonne is a Chartered Occupational Psychologist, a Master Practitioner in Neurolinguistic Programming, and I need to slow down again, and has an MSc in Occupational Psychology and a BSc in Psychology through Queen's University Belfast. Yvonne was the 2018 Northern Ireland Eisenhower Fellow and a leading founder of the British Psychology Society Northern Ireland Division of Occupational Psychology. So a very, very impressive CV. And Yvonne, thank you very much for being with us this afternoon or this morning for some of you who are in other parts of the world. So over to you, Yvonne. You have somewhere between 5 and 7 minutes. I'll send you a little message when you hit 6 minutes, just if it's helpful, and then I'll come back in. Thanks very much, Yvonne.
Thank you, Helen. And on behalf of An Garda Síochána, just say thank you to Fulbright and the Policing Authority for the opportunity today, and for all of you who have tuned in. In response to the question posed, I would suggest we all have a role to play, and we all have a role to play in terms of driving the change. What we've heard from this morning and this afternoon is the issues we're discussing, these important issues, are pan-societal, and a pan-societal response is required. And obviously, we within policing have a key role to play. I've been asked to share some reflections on the future of policing and really what that means from a diversity and engagement perspective. And I'm going to talk to a couple of points: the future of policing, the link to legitimacy and what really being representative and inclusive looks like. So to begin with, in terms of the future of policing, I think there's never been more of a time that we need to get better at this across government, looking at what the world looks like out 10 to 20 to 50 years. And it's only through doing that work we can establish what will be the demand and what will be the need the policing is going to have to fulfill. So that is the first piece I would like to raise, that is some of the key elements which will be required to drive that change out into the future. We already know policing and the world has become more complicated. We're ever more interconnected, and has been mentioned this morning. We've the war in Ukraine, we've just faced a pandemic. There are a whole host of things that affect one part of the world and then the rest of us, and policing has a role to play within that. We know out into the future, we will see heightened levels of migration. We will see global crime and terrorism, unfortunately. And we will see people connect in greater speed than we've ever seen before in terms of social media and access to the web. And what that tells us is we need to continually change how we deliver a policing service to be fit for purpose. We're seeing societal changes and generational changes. We're seeing across the world protests arise in Ireland that would be replicated in Australia, for example. And we're seeing people use their voice at a much greater scale than we maybe have before. And what that means for policing, a few things. Number one, we are ever more accountable, and that is rightly so. And in addition to that, you will see individuals critically challenge and have views on how policing is delivered. And again, that's a really great thing to see. Those shifts in terms of public opinion and public voice are critical for us to take a hard look at ourselves to ensure that we still are relevant. And in terms of that relevance, I look to over the pandemic, policing here in Ireland stepping forward and becoming what it needed to be for the communities we serve. So, for example, bringing shopping to people who were living in fear, not knowing what was ahead of them, became something we within policing did overnight and probably would never have considered before. And it's those moments and those opportunities whereby we really look into our communities and understand what's going on for people and what they need, that we have that opportunity as well to shift in terms of our overall approach. In terms of relevance, though, I would like to link into now legitimacy, and this is a critical theme as we look across policing internationally at this point in time. We're very lucky within Ireland that we have a police service, and it is a service, not a force. We have a police service that does receive wide-scale confidence from the communities we serve. However, that can never be taken for granted. And to that end, we continually need to ensure that we are legitimate to all persons within Ireland. And as we've seen many new people join the country to enter into Ireland, to make it their home, we do have to ask the question, are we legitimate to everyone? And I would answer probably not, and probably not because we are not yet representative and inclusive of all of the communities that we serve. And part of the driver towards the change we need to achieve is being so, whereby individuals from across the country can look at An Garda Síochána and can see people who look like them and sound like them and maybe have the lived experiences that they also have had. So there's a huge focus, and necessarily so for us now within An Garda Síochána, to seek to outreach to the communities we serve, all of the communities we serve, to seek to understand the key causal factors, perhaps, as to why somebody may not even consider An Garda Síochána as the place to come and work. Through our outreach in terms of our Garda members out in the communities across Ireland, using those opportunities to speak to people and to understand and to hear the lived experiences that they have had, and perhaps experiences they may have had of policing in other jurisdictions. And it is only through that we will better understand as we move forward what further changes we need to make. We are a policing organisation, and critically so. Policing organisations, like many organisations, have invariably been designed by men and by white men. So part of the work, and there is work to be done, is really scaling back and looking at how our organisation functions and which of the key elements need to be reformed and adapted over time to ensure not only do we attract underrepresented communities to seek to join, but also some of the elements that were raised earlier, that this is an inclusive organisation and that people don't feel hidden or have to remain hidden, and that they can bring their full selves to work. And that's not just about the characteristics that we hold. Every one of us has diversity of thought and opinion. And this is where I would like to take the conversation to the issue of power, how we ensure that diverse voices are heard in the problem-solving tables and arenas of policing and in the decision-making forums. So it's not simply about recruiting, but it is also about ensuring diversity of thought is in every room which has a power element attached to it. Lastly, with respect to our broader outreach and legitimacy, within Garda Síochána, we're currently developing, as the Minister has referred to, our updated diversity, inclusion and equality strategy. And this is unique in its own right for us as an organisation, whereby we're developing an internal action plan and an external action plan in terms of outreach and inclusion, as we see both elements being critical. Just to end, in terms of the key individuals who have a role to play in terms of driving the change, within Garda Síochána, we take our responsibilities around diversity and inclusion really seriously. We just recently launched a Garda trainee competition, and across the organisation we had members out within the communities they serve seeking to identify and to support people to join. And we will only want to build on that going forward. In addition, the Minister referred to our recently launched also intern programme. And these are only a number of initiatives we will want to be embarking upon over the forthcoming years. There is a lot of work to be done, but this is essential and it is paramount and it is everyone's responsibility. And I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Yvonne. And there's a couple of things there that hopefully we'll get a little bit of time to return to. You know, particularly, I think one of the things that strikes me, and in fairness, Aoife said it at the beginning of the seminar, that this is a fairly, you know, it's a beginning of a conversation, and that even if you look at ourselves, we're not exactly the most diverse of people talking perhaps this afternoon, you know, and it's about, you know, how do you widen the conversation to listen to those who are being policed or in a better way. So I do think that is the next step, but also not waiting. I think I liked, you know, what you said about, you know, you can't just wait until the workforce is inclusive. You need to talk to power. But I think another thing we might talk about is, you know, the behavior towards community. You don't have to be of a certain community to behave in an appropriate way towards that community or that cadre of people. So we may get a chance. But Yvonne, thank you very, very much. And we welcome you back in a few minutes for the Q&A. Thanks. So now, Steve, thank you for joining us. And Professor Steve Morreale has a distinguished background in policing, over 30 years experience in US law enforcement, and he had retired as Assistant Special Agent in charge of the US Department of Health and Human Services, the Office of Investigation, the Office of Inspector General. Steve also holds a doctoral degree in public administration from Nova Southeastern University in Fort Lauderdale. And again, for nearly 20 years, he served as Drug Enforcement Administration, serving as a special agent and managing agent, as well as serving with Dover, New Hampshire Police, and with the US Army Military Police Corps. Steve received the Distinguished Service Award from the Secretary of US Health and Human Services for his role in responding and leading a team of agents to assist in disaster relief and recovery at the site of the World Trade Center attacks in September 2001. He previously was a visiting scholar to the University of Limerick as part of the Fulbright project, conducting research in Garda Síochána's training curriculum, and he continues to be quite involved with us here, which is great, Steve. So you do know a lot as well about the Irish environment. So look, thank you very much again. I'll leave you to speak. I'll give you a little signal at around 6 minutes, and then I'll come back in then for the wider Q&A. Thanks very much, Steve. Over to you.
Thank you. And thanks for having me. I very much appreciate being able to bring some ideas from our side of the pond along with Kathy, but more importantly, what I've learned there. I'm constantly learning. I just came back, as I had told you earlier. So one of the things that the question to us is, who drives change in policing? And it cannot be unilateral. And I think Kathy said that very clearly. And I think that's so important, and people have to constantly be asking, who's missing at the table? Who do we have to reach out to? Who do we have to talk to? I think that's so important. And if I want to, I'd like to make a comparison to what goes on here in the United States as opposed to what's going on in Ireland. Many years ago, probably 15, 16, there was a report that came out. It was a commission, much like you had in Ireland, but it was on the future of, it was the 21st century policing report. And it came up with 6 pillars. The problem with those pillars in the United States is that they are aspirational at best. There's nobody forcing, riding police leaders to do anything with those 6 pillars. They are taking hold slowly, but it's on an individual basis. The difference between the United States and Ireland, of course, is you have a singular police agency, and we have 18,000 different police agencies from the federal, state, county, and municipal levels. And each one of them can be anywhere from 3 people to 35,000. So everyone is different. What I see in the report that Dr. O'Toole was the chair of for Ireland is that it is not aspirational. I'm seeing it move forward. It's taking time, but I'm seeing it move forward. And I think that's so impressive to me. Anytime I have interacted with people who are especially leaders and ground troops with Garda, I have been thoroughly impressed with their professionalism, with their care, with the way they handle situations and circumstances, and the way they reach out to the community. But I do think there is major improvement in both of our countries to reach out to those that are not as well represented. One of the things I thought as I was listening is my second career is in higher education, and I've been working with UL and with the Garda College. But what we do on our campus and across the campuses in the United States is we look for those who are first generation in college. And imagine if you bring somebody on in the Garda and they have never had experience, they have no relatives who are Gardaí. Imagine creating a mentoring system for that to provide encouragement and support and answer questions and guide them through the system. We end up creating first generation mentors. And I think that is pretty important for sure. As we think about how do we engage others and bring them to the table, and certainly Chief O'Toole has done this in a number of places in Boston and in Seattle, it is to conduct some outreach. And we have to identify where we are missing feedback from. Police, in many cases, they do not necessarily like it when you bring a problem. I would say that police from all over the world have to allow people to bring issues to the table. In other words, allowing problem identifiers to come forward, and then you work on them. We can take a look at them in meetings and see where we're at, what we have to do, who we have to engage, and so on. Also, the other thing is that there are so many groups that need a seat at the table. Whether it is public health side, certainly showed us. If you think about how we were able to pivot and how flexible and responsive the government period had to be during the recent pandemic, I think that's pretty interesting. And it showed that policing can be responsive. Imagine shutting the pubs down in Ireland. Who the hell would have thunk that? I see you smile. Who would have thunk that? But it had to be done, and it saved an awful lot of lives. But it proves that the Garda and police agencies across the world were able to be responsive. And I think that is so important. Here's what I like, the recommendations that are in the future of policing in Ireland. They have teeth. They are moving forward. We're seeing this with diversity and inclusion. As I mentioned earlier, my work with the Garda and UL on bringing mental health practitioners into police cars to deal with the rising mental health problems is extremely important. And a pilot will lead to making changes and tweaking that program so that it can be pushed out all over the country, the island, which I think is so important. I think we need to use social media to our advantage to communicate better with groups and continue what I see as I follow what's going on in Garda, some of the community organizational outreach that goes on. So that's it for me. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it. I look forward to working with the Garda, and I can tell you that every time I go over there, we're learning from each other. So I appreciate the opportunity and the time today.
Steve, thank you very much. And you can stay there on the line. I didn't even get to give you the 6-minute warning, so I'm very impressed, very, very, very impressed. So if I could welcome back Yvonne and Kathleen as well, if they want to turn on their videos. And I would just encourage people, we have the Q&A facility, if people have any questions they would like to pose to the panel, you know, just feel free. I'll keep an eye on that, so I'll be looking across at the screen while we do that. Just an opening question, just to you, Yvonne. I mean, one of the things we've been talking about is kind of diversity within recruitment, and in your role, you know, about how getting people from diverse backgrounds. But how do we ensure that if officers are from diverse backgrounds are recruited, how they're retained? You know, I think Margaret made a comment earlier just about, you know, that a person from a diverse community, could they just be a guard and not have the dual responsibility? And we've seen that, I think, in the Garda Síochána, when people come in and then they leave. And, you know, I'm sure you have thoughts around that, because you're putting a lot of efforts into trying to attract people to apply. But is there thinking around how you would retain people to ensure you have that kind of maintain that piece?
Thanks, Helen. So I suppose firstly to respond, I worked on a programme in Northern Ireland as part of the pattern reforms, looking at optimising the number of Catholics and women who joined the organisation. To your very question, that was critical, that it's only one step in terms of people actually joining, then how you ensure the environment is conducive to people actually flourishing. And some of the work I did there, which I am now seeking to replicate in Garda Síochána, is understanding, firstly, as I mentioned earlier, the factors which may have inhibited people from joining in the first place. And then secondly, looking into the organisation to really uncover key issues that may cause issue for somebody, and try and address them. So if it's down to, for example, you know, for somebody who you know, needs specific toileting facilities, prayer facilities, if it's even down to people feeling that they just aren't willing to use their voice, that they don't have the confidence to do so, some of the pieces that I would want to do more work on is setting up greater staff associations, minority support associations, individuals who will be able to speak freely about their own experiences. I think the issue is that this is a joint responsibility. It should not fall on the individuals who join, though, and they should be able to perform the role they were recruited for. So that the work really is in around creating an inclusive culture, and to do that, understanding the key inhibitors for somebody to actually flourish. So very much so focusing on engagement and looking at the whole lifeline journey of somebody joining and exiting the organisation, some of those barriers and those opportunities they may face. So they would be some of the key pieces we have started to work on here in Garda Síochána.
Great, Yvonne. And just while, sorry to pick on you a second time, but a question has just come in and it is about the AGS. So Cornell Altano is just asking, do you know how many members of different ethnic groups currently serve as civilians, and are they being encouraged to build bridges in their own communities in any way? Now, I know that there is a struggle in terms of information at times, but maybe if you can just have a go at that question as well, and then I'll...
Yeah, so unfortunately, as it stands within the organisation, we don't have the systems to be able to capture kind of the representativeness of our workforce. Now, that is something we're currently working on. And it is important because it is only when we have that information that we at least can know how far we need to strive further to bridge the gap in terms of being fully representative. But what I would say is that across, we see this as one organisation. So from the Garda staff and Garda members, particularly when we were launching the Garda trainee competition, we spoke out to everyone to say, can you use your opportunities, your moments of truth within your own communities to talk about a career in policing? So we will want to have the ability to have greater workforce data in the future, and internationally the whole focus is on, well, perhaps target setting, but very much so looking at the as is and the to be and a plan for bridging that gap. So that's something we will be working on.
Thanks very much, Yvonne. And just Steve and Kathleen, just to broaden it out a bit, I mean, one of the things that I'm sure you've both had experience of, is around, it's not just about the inclusivity of the workforce, it's also about the behaviours that your current workforce demonstrate towards when policing. Are there any words of advice you'd have even to us as we're considering this, or things that you've learned? Maybe Kathleen, if you want to start off, and then I'll ask Steve to come in.
Well, first of all, I would say that, we need to put into place the appropriate policies and procedures to hold people accountable for performance and behaviors. I know that we've done a lot of that work now here in the US, but then we also need to train people appropriately. When I was trained in policing decades ago, we were fighting the war on crime in the US, and we were teaching people to go out, and it was the police versus the community, as opposed to the police working with the community. And we were measured by how fast we got to our calls and how many arrests we made and how many tickets we wrote. And, no wonder our relationship with the community deteriorated over the course of years. And now, recognizing that police work goes well beyond enforcement and really should focus on providing service to vulnerable people, we need to change the ethos. We need to change our training to align with that ethos. And we've done a lot of that. For many years, we didn't invest a lot in in-service training. We've invested mostly in recruit training. And now we've spent a lot of time in recent years training officers in things like dealing effectively with people in mental health crisis, recognizing their implicit biases. We've really changed our training to align more with the ethos we're trying to promote. So I think that that's a huge issue. And then if people misbehave, we need to hold them accountable, whether it's internally or through oversight structures.
Thanks very much, Kathleen. And just when you mentioned that you spoke earlier as well about the complexity of the police work that people do, and I know your commission, the Commission on the Future of Policing in Ireland, made recommendations around that kind of interagency working and that kind of intersection between public health. I mean, is there more in terms of driving change? I mean, it's not just society, justice and policing. It would seem that it's much more than that. Is there anything from those recommendations around making that real, and the kind of vision that you had for that interagency working?
Yes, because in policing, we certainly have we've failed in many respects over the years on both sides of the Atlantic, but the police are often at the end of other failed systems too, whether they're failed systems in social services or health services or mental health services or education. So we need to harness our resources. In Boston, we came together across all those sectors to deal with the gang violence issue, and we were able to reduce homicides from over 150 a year to approximately 30 in just a matter of a few years, because we harnessed our resources and worked collaboratively. In Seattle, we organized, and Steve alluded to this too, it's a growing trend in the US. We worked very closely with people in social services and mental health services and had a crisis response unit that included social workers and mental health clinicians, and working side by side with police. We established a navigation team involving the police and other services to address the needs of the homeless, the people who are homeless in our community. So it's hard work. We really need to bring people together. But that's the only way it works. That's why I was really enthusiastic that the Taoiseach's department took the leadership role in the implementation of the report, because it will require a joined up government approach.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Kathleen. And Steve, do you want to just continue on that theme and just first, I suppose, first of all, talk about the behaviours question that I talked about first, and then second of all, just around that kind of interagency, that sort of the complexity of the mental health dilemma as well, and how we can.
I'd be happy to. I think, as I'm listening, I'm thinking that so many of the things that police are called on to do is because they're the only 24/7, no matter where we are in the world. They're only 24/7. And in many cases, many of the social service organizations have been underfunded. And so it falls on the laps of the police. And if there's nobody available, if I walk into a house and there is somebody with a child and I have to take that person away for whatever reason, I've got to deal with that child. And what do I do with that person on a Friday? Where do I take that? And you will call social services and there's nobody available. We don't have overtime. We don't have anybody available. And so the police end up babysitting. So there's been mission creep. And I think as we begin to identify the many problems that are recurring, then it begins to help to figure out, all right, again, who do we need at the table to solve this problem? That's really very important. The other thing that came to mind was I'm looking at the ethnic groups in the recent 2016, 2021 demographic profile for Ireland with 5.2 million people. You're seeing 82 Irish travelers, less than 1%, white 9.5%, Asian 2.1%. Black at 1.4, and other. I wish we knew what other and unspecified, because it would make our work a little bit easier for sure. But I want to make this distinction, and that is when we're talking to young people who are coming into the job, it becomes very, very important for them to shake that predetermined mindset. I talked about implicit bias. What do we know? And I'm going to be very candid, and that is, do we believe that every traveler in Ireland is a criminal? That is not true. No different than when I was with DEA and I arrested Colombians for drug dealing. At one point in time, my narrow-mindedness said then all Colombians must be drug dealers. That could not be further from the truth. And I think we have to disabuse ourselves of that. So what Kathy talked about is making sure that our officers are humble and are compassionate and take the time to realize if you're not engaged with the community, then you are doing the policing. You are not policing. You're not policing with the people. That becomes so important. And so we've been accused of profiling in the past, and that's something I was just working on yesterday as a consultant, is somebody profiling, stopping only Black drivers in this particular community. The last thing I will say is this, that one of the things that came up, and you were there, Helen, when we talked about the symposium at UL on mental health and the CIT, crisis intervention teams. Up in Northern Ireland, where Yvonne hails from, they talked about policing the vulnerable. And I think using that terminology from here on could be extremely valuable for the Garda. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Stephen. You've actually raised something that's come in. I'm just as the Q&A is hotting up. So there's a few. First of all, just to say, Famida, it's just a comment for Yvonne. She's a diversity intern. I don't know whether you've seen that there, and just a very encouraging step taken by yourselves. So I think thanks for that. And somebody's asked a question here about, and again, sorry Yvonne, but it probably comes across to you, but does the less than enthusiastic reception to the Garda Reserve from sworn members suggest that there might be significant internal resistance to change? And then there's sort of another kind of carry on to that, and it talks about something Steve touched on there. How do we overcome the challenges? And this is not just in the police service, this is in society as well. How do we overcome the negative attitudes towards members of the travelling community? So Yvonne, I'll let you start, and if Steve or Kathleen, you have anything to add in on that, you can stick your hands up.
Before we start, the one thing, and my note was also, I did not mean to focus only on travelers, but the same could be said is, are all Black men criminals? And if that's the predisposition we come at, then that changes my interaction with all Black males, especially young Black males. I think we need to disabuse ourselves. Keep your guard up, but it doesn't mean that you have to approach them in a hostile way, in an accusatory way.
But I think, Steve, what you said earlier, I know Siobhan McKenna made the comment, which, as you said, and I agree, was chilling. You know, that things are worse for young people in the Black community now than when she grew up here in the 70s and 80s. And I think we really need to listen to that. And she also made the comment about ask people from the traveller community, and I can see you all nodding. But like, how do we change those negative attitudes? And I suppose going back to the original question around the Garda Reserve, because I know, Yvonne, you know, at policing authority meetings in public, even before your time, we've spoken about that the Garda Reserve is actually a really good opportunity to bring people in, that sort of intern type role, to get people in the experience from diverse communities. But if there's already a negative attitude towards the concept of reserves, you've got another thing to overcome. So a nice, easy question there.
Thanks, Helen. Well, I suppose firstly, you know, we all have a role to play in policing, more generally speaking, but within the police service itself, pointing back to the question around the reserve, there is no hierarchy. Everyone has a role to play, and fundamentally, the Garda Reserve have a critical role to play. I do think, notwithstanding any negativity that may have been picked up by the person who asked the question, we have a huge opportunity coming forward in the autumn when we intend on launching our next Garda Reserve competition. And I think, number one, huge opportunity to sell the benefits of a reserve to support policing. Going back to my first point, everyone has a really credible role to play. And then secondly, I do know from research I've done internationally in around some of our underrepresented communities, at times they will not want to leave their other job or take that big risk of joining a full-time member post, but may well consider joining our reserve and doing that as part of the rest of their life. So there's huge opportunities there for us, and we've learned quite a lot from the outreach we did for the Garda trainee competition to maximise that. So I think it's a fresh opportunity to highlight the benefit and to reach into our communities, really to see as we scope out the role what more we might need to do to promote it and effectively potentially to adjust it to meet the needs of our communities. Going back to the point and around the comment around perceptions of the travelling community, I think there's a job of work for us all to do in Ireland. This is a wonderful place. It is a progressive country. When we walk down the street, we see people from all over the world contributing to life and society here in Ireland. But there is work to be done in terms of equal status for all, and also for everyone to feel that they have parity of esteem and equality within the country. So I go back to my point earlier on, these are pan-societal issues with pan-societal responses. So I think there's a job of work for us all to be much more inclusive. From an AGS on Garda Síochána perspective, we will continue to do more within the space of cultural awareness, emotional awareness of all our members when they're out working within our communities to understand the subtle nuances of people's traditions and their values, and also to ensure that people manage the biases, and we all have biases that they may well have. So there's a piece with regards to outreach and education, and I would like to say there's quite a lot of work already ongoing on diversity and engagement with various groups within the traveller community, so that we can understand what it's like really for the travelling community to be policed with on Garda Síochána and vice versa. So Thank you.
Thanks very much, Yvonne. Kathleen, did you want to add something? You've taken your...
I was just going to cite 3 programs that I thought were really effective in different organizations I worked in, particularly for recruiting younger people. In Boston, we had a cadet program for students from the ages of 17 to 22, where they could come into the organization and, work side by side with police and really get to understand what policing is all about. And, they received training and supports, and they received some educational opportunities as a result. And we really focused on underserved communities when we were recruiting cadets for that program. Similarly, in Seattle, we had an exploring program, which was part of a scouting initiative. We welcomed young people from the ages of, I think it was 14 to 20, who came into the organization, again, worked very closely on community events, and really provided a bridge to the community for many of our police officers. And then finally, we had an outstanding partnership in Seattle with Seattle University, where we brought in undergraduate and graduate students to work as interns. Mostly they just got university credits for doing it. And the majority of people who participated in that program ended up working either in sworn positions later in the Seattle Police Department, or in unsworn positions, very important positions such as analysts and other management roles. So I think that there are a number of models out there that could be easily replicated, particularly focusing on younger people, and particularly focusing on younger people in traditionally underserved communities.
Ellen, I'd like to add to that too. Thank you, Kathy, because it's interesting. At the cadet program, all of these are feeders, potential feeder systems, and that's what Kathy's talking about. The other thing that is very popular over here, and it may be over there, I don't know, I don't presume, but it's a Citizen Police Academy. And Citizen Police Academies can be 7 or 8 weeks where you bring people in, it's in the evening, get to know your police, share people, show them the dogs, bring them out in cars, that kind of stuff. But we've seen it happen with senior Citizen Police Academies. We've done high school Citizen Police Academies. We've done Latino Citizen Police Academies. Imagine that you're bringing people together. I don't mean to isolate, certainly we don't, but if you show up in a high school that is in an underserved community, it could be very, very valuable. So just food for thought. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Steve and Kathleen. Lots of ideas there for Yvonne. And just one related question, Yvonne. One of the questions, and you may not have the answer now from Jacinta Brack, was just again in relation to travellers applying for the diversity scheme, and how some of those barriers can be overcome. I'm sure that's something that you're thinking about and exploring. And I know Siobhan mentioned that as well, even in terms of the wider civil service, not just focusing on the traveller community, but those barriers that we impose. So is that something that you're working actively with the Public Appointments Service on, or even internally?
Yeah, so I mean, some of the barriers we already addressed in the last Garda trainee competition with regards to the number of languages that people had to be able to speak, and that was actually as a direct result of feedback we'd received from the travelling community. But there still is further work to do. It was mentioned earlier on with regards to the status people have when they come into the country and how that can affect them in terms of employment. And then obviously within An Garda Síochána, we do have quite strict criteria with regards to vetting into the organisation. So they're all elements that can have an impact. What I would say on the intern programme, in addition to the Garda trainee campaign we've just run, we are reviewing them in terms of lessons learned for the next time that we launch.
Great, thanks very much, Yvonne. Just a slight, sorry, Siobhan, you popped in there. Did you want to? No, you didn't want to say anything.
No, I didn't. I just wasn't sure whether I was going to be drawn into the panel, and I figured I should turn my camera on.
No, you're fine. I was actually just name checking you for what you had said earlier, the children, and that's something we're just having, a discussion around in terms of.
Yeah, no, I've been following it. It's really interesting, and it all seems to be moving in the right direction. And I'm less concerned about the speed than I am about moving in the direction. We will get there eventually. I am 100% confident. It's just to avoid some of the pitfalls along the way, I suppose, that our closer cousins have had to navigate. That's my only wish.
Yeah, no, and I think we agree, and some of that is going to be the importance of the openness of the organisation as well. If we're focusing on the police, one question I have, and this is probably, well, it can be for any of the three of you, is around, you know, when you're looking at the performance of police, or if they're being judged, if you're judging people on detections or particular things like that, are you then losing diversity, the importance of diversity and equality at the centre, that, you know, somebody doesn't get benefit from doing certain things, or some of those outreaches that you talk about? And how have you you know, well, Yvonne is nodding, so Yvonne, feel free to jump in. I'm just conscious I was sort of, you know, I directed a number of questions at you, but are there particular things that can be done in terms of policing that would encourage giving some sort of credit to police officers, which puts this front and center and really important to the people will do it?
Can I just say something, Helen? What we count is what's going to matter. So if we're counting how many car stops we make or how many arrests we make, then that's what we're going to get. If we're going to start counting in a different way, and I want to hear from my colleagues, then you'll get what you observe or what you rate. And I think that's really important. So if you want community outreach, then you have to give some, not compensation, but some advantage to doing that. Is that what we want? And believe me, Pavlov's dogs theory will say, if that's what's getting some pats on the back, then I'll do that too. So just food for thought. Thanks.
Yeah. And before I let anybody else in, I'm going to say one of the things that we in the policing authority have been pressing is, if you don't have information and data around who you're policing and who you're providing service to, it's actually quite impossible to even assess yourselves as a police service. So, you know, it's very difficult for us to ask, well, how are you doing? Have you improved? Or going back to Siobhan's piece, you know, that are you moving in the right direction? Well, who knows? You know, are we being, you know, and some of this stuff then gets termed anecdotal, you know, that. Now I have a couple of questions. Yvonne, do you want to come in on that? And I have a couple of questions because I'm actually almost late, but I've been told we can have an extra 5 minutes if people will bear with me. So I'm going to take one or two questions from the Q&A before we conclude. So Yvonne, do you want to say anything on that last piece?
Very briefly, I suppose it's about focusing on the outcomes we're seeking to achieve as a policing service. So it's not about just counting kind of detections. So where we can get that information from at a general level, we can get it from public surveys, and you know, we'll soon have data to share with respect to that in terms of confidence. But actually, to get what you're talking about, it is drilling down at a community level through our, you know, our local members. Engaging with, you know, representative groups, with community groups to get those examples of where we're doing well and being able to bring that back into the system. And particularly where that becomes important is we have a code of ethics everyone signs up to. Human rights as a key element is kind of the cornerstone and the foundation of diversity and inclusion. That is seen as a key element required of every member of the organisation. So through to making it important in training, making it important every single day in operational briefs, and then making it important when we're looking to select those to be promoted to senior leadership levels, that it is those examples of where you've had a real impact with communities that actually factor and matter.
And can I, and I'm not expecting you to answer this, but can I just make a comment, something that strikes me over the last number of years, and I think it's quite relevant for the audience here today, because we are talking about a combination of practitioners and researchers. I think one of those things around opening up a little bit more to the concept of partnerships in researching, so that you move from the anecdotal, you know, to the evidence-based, even if it is, you know, in terms of a smaller piece. So I think there's something there that as we're moving in a direction that could ask questions, but ask somebody else to ask them independently, because sometimes the surveys are not being answered by people in certain groups. So we might be getting, oh yeah, we've all got confidence in policing, but actually I've had no interaction with the police in the last 8 months. You know, are we getting the answers? So it's about maybe delving a little deeper in the research piece. I'm just going to turn to there's a couple of questions here. Helen Ryan's asked a couple of questions, and there's another question later on, and I'm going to kind of try and combine them a little bit together, but it does talk about our training of police officers. And again, I'll ask this to any of you, you know, is literacy awareness training and ways to respond sensitively, you know, is it factored into training? And Helen makes the point that 1 in 6 adults struggle with reading and understanding. And again, that whole, I mean, if you go back to what Donal said earlier on from the NDA, that piece about communication with the public and using plain language. And then Mel Duffy then comes in with something that's not quite the same, but it is about that facilitation of neurodiversity and people understanding. And I think, Yvonne, you might have mentioned that, but just about people with ADHD or autism, or who might be blind, or who might be physically disabled or deaf, you know, whatever that piece is. How does the training of officers and how needs, because I'm not sure it's sufficient yet, and what are the plans for doing that and improving and moving things towards that?
I think we could do a whole separate session on training alone. For years, I've advocated for taking all of the non-tactical training out of a rigid police academy environment and into a university environment where police officers are training with people representing other disciplines, people that they'll have to work with eventually on complicated problems when they graduate from the college, the Garda College, right? So, you know, whether, again, this applies on both sides of the Atlantic, because I think that, you know, too many of the police academies here in North America are insular and, you know, don't effectively train people. We're hearing a lot over here about the need for adult learning principles. I will defer to the academics on that, but I know that we've developed a lot of scenario training now for our officers, both recruit officers and in-service officers, you know, particularly around the way they engage with people. And they're required to go through scenario after scenario and complicated situations. And then they're assessed and they're counseled as to how they can improve their behaviors. So I think we need massive overhaul of police training, and we're starting to recognize that, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
And I think you said as well, Kathleen, at the beginning, it's also like if you're advertising roles as the guns and the exciting and the rolling around the place, but actually a lot of it is about community and social work and psychology. You might even be bringing in people from the wrong piece. But I think that's come out in your own Commission on Future Policing as well, around those partnerships. And I know, Yvonne, there's ambitions within the Guards to bring those recommendations forward in terms of certain elements of police training happening in our third level institutions. So
Helen?
Yeah, go on, Steve.
May I? First of all, what I don't think people understand, and certainly it probably is new to Kathy and it was new to me, the portfolios that you require, the reflection that you ask of your officers is absolutely amazing, and it's missing in the United States. There's not a lot of that happening, and you have to be very proud of that. So that reflective piece is good. But when you ask the question about how do we get some change, I would point you to the executive core qualifications. I'm happy to share that with you. The Office of Personnel Management for the US uses that to assess people who are rising to the highest level in the senior executive service, much like your chief superintendents or higher. And I think that would be something valuable. But asking questions about what have you done to understand your community? Who have you brought forward to have a dialogue, and what changes have you made is a way that you can begin to push this and raise the importance of people who are competing for superintendent or chief superintendent.
Great, and I'm going to allow Yvonne to have the last word. Her hand is up there, and because I'm definitely be sacked, I won't be asked back to chair. I've gone 6 minutes over now, so off you go, Yvonne. Last word, and then we'll close.
Yeah, just very briefly. So within training, obviously, the importance of neurodiversity and understanding the needs and abilities and strengths of all people. But what is important is that everyone treats each individual as an individual. And what we can't afford to happen is that it's seen you train people and therefore it will happen. Because that is the stereotype, to assume one person with Asperger's is the exact same as another, or one person who may speak one language is the same as another. It will drive a certain behaviour. So some of the key things we train our members in the college in Templemore is actually to ask questions, to understand the individual who's in front of them, and then to respond accordingly. So, and I think that's the essence of diversity and inclusion, really. Treat each person as you find them and respond accordingly.
Thanks very much. And that echoes the theme from the earlier panel about listening, you know. So thanks very, very, very much to you all. And I'll hand back to Sinead now with apologies for running over time. Thanks. Bye-bye now.
Thank you so much, Helen, Kathleen, Yvonne and Steve, for an incredibly interesting and engaging, I don't know if it was 45 minutes or an hour, but it felt like an absolutely incredible experience just to learn so much about what research is being done in this area and the ongoing work that is happening here. I'm reminded of a quote that I saw recently in a slightly different context, but I think it fits. If we aren't hungry for social justice, it's probably because we are too full with privilege. The discussion during our second panel has been centrally concerned with addressing issues of power, legitimacy, and representation. Kathleen told us that any democratic policing strategy must be built on the fundamental principle of human rights. The true story of policing unfolds at the intersection of public health and public safety. Authentic and robust community engagement are absolutely essential to drive meaningful change in policing. And these must be supported at a high level by the policing leadership and by government. Yvonne outlined how the issues faced by policing authorities in Ireland and in the US and around the world are pan-societal. And so the solutions must also be pan-societal. Our policing services need to be constantly changing to keep up with the changes in society. These shifting public voices provide a lens through which we can ensure that policing services remain relevant and legitimate within the communities that they serve. And Steve reaffirmed that we cannot drive change unilaterally. We must always be looking to see who is missing from the table. And at the same time, having got that seat at the table, let those people at the table identify the issues that are relevant to them. I think you'll agree with me that our panel discussions this afternoon have been fascinating. And before we finish up our webinar this afternoon, or indeed almost this morning, I'm not sure if we're still at this morning in the US, but please join me in welcoming Dr. Dara Fitzgerald. He is the Executive Director of the Fulbright Commission, to say a few words. Dr. Fitzgerald earned a BSc and a PhD in biology and IT from Maynooth University and University College Cork. He has founded and led a number of companies and acted as the US Federal Liaison for Enterprise Ireland in Washington, DC and Dublin. Dara.
Many thanks, Sinead. I start forgetting those past histories, but first and foremost, I want to thank everybody, particularly Aoife, for the invitation to be part of and listen to the really excellent and engaging speakers today. Congratulations to Fulbrighter Aoife Delaney. This is actually great use of a Fulbright Alum Award. Our job really is to enable people like Aoife and Steve and Donal and Sinead have given back. They've acted as Fulbright ambassadors. And of course, thanks to Marianne and Kathleen for both your service. This meeting really has been a learning experience for me. I have lots of little notes. I should say previously I worked with police forces in Ireland, the UK and Italy, and really not until I joined Fulbright did I again become part of an ecosystem that exhibited such open collegiality as among police forces. Similar to Fulbright, there is a fantastic global community operating with largely the same goals. Marianne Doyle already represented aspects of the Fulbright Commission and the programme, so I don't think I'm going to cover the same ground. Instead, I really just mention our efforts for diversity, equity and inclusion at the Commission. In developing DEI at the Commission over the last 7 years, in terms of my involvement anyway, we've learned much, not least that our work on DEI has actually been very positive for the Commission and for our programmes. Not just for the applicants and awardees who we believe are now better included and supported. As such, our DEI policy has never been at odds with our strategy and other policies. Marianne also remarked that this is not a unique happenstance, but rather a natural outcome noted elsewhere. So I would encourage everybody to recognize this. This work has been very successful, I think, although representing much of the success is actually still an ongoing challenge. And that in itself, if we could better represent it, I think we could probably better have further results further along. So that's part of the story. Sinead Murnan mentioned our DEI panel. They have been truly helpful, pragmatic and engaged. Thanks, Donal. with them on board, I feel we can do so much more than we would have been able to do just on our own. I can say today's Fulbrighters are more diverse in so many ways, from underrepresented institutions in Ireland and the US to ethnic and gender diversities, etc. The programme and the alumni community is therefore much richer. Some take-home messages that I have written down, there are probably lots, but they include comments from Steve, who quoted, seek first to understand and then begin to understand. And Paul followed up with a similar, shut up and listen. Essentially, we don't have the experience or the fears that others might have, so we're not always coming from their space, irrespective of what we think. Paul and others also advise not to expect that a small diversity labelled group to carry the total weight of representation and making changes. And I think when you're leading this, it's a very important part to kind of keep reminding yourself that there are people who are willing, but not necessarily should all the information come from them. That's not diversity either. Donald promoted communications, which brings the capacity to engage with each other. He called it information trading. I really like that. Police must be able to communicate with people with different needs, e.g. correct language and approach, and Gardaí need to be so informed. I think we probably all need a little bit of that as well. Siobhan advises that racism and disconnect are growing. So I think what I took from that is it behoves us to do better, you know, and to lead from the front and be obvious in that. Margaret asked us to consider the veracity of inclusion. So do people believe they're included just because we think they are, do they? And so on. There were many good points. Today we've had opinions from those with Fulbright experience, and broader than that. Fulbright has always been open to scholars, students, and indeed professionals. We support all disciplines, including justice through law, policing, policy, etc. And I would honestly imagine that most, if not all, the attendees today could consider applying for a Fulbright Award, in particular our All Discipline Award. As it stands, and like with many other disciplines, we don't have specific law enforcement award. This, however, is something we would be open to exploring if we felt there was appetite, and I would leave that open to people to maybe engage with us on that. Again, really what we want to do is engage people with passion, irrespective of their other labels. We are even inclusive to the diversity police bring to the Fulbright community, so please remember that. Just a small comment why apply to Fulbright. It is prestigious, but at its heart, it is about cultural exchange and people. So whilst our peers may have similar jobs and interests, this is changed by experiences and perspectives. This can be impacted not just by working side by side or digitally side by side, but actually having the same daily experiences both within and outside of work. For example, being stuck in the same traffic jam, stuck in the rain, or managing high rental costs. Diversity of colleagues as well in the same locations can work in the same way.
I'm very sorry to interrupt. I'm going to have to ask you to slow down at this point. I'm very sorry for the interpretation.
Apologies. I'm almost finished anyway. So I just wanted to say that Senator Fulbright understood this intrinsically. This vision is still strong after 75 years of the programme. It and Senator Fulbright have been challenged over the period. And more recently, Fulbright, like the Gardaí, is also undergoing a period of self-reflection, which actually seems like a good place to stop and pass the baton to the next speaker. And apologies to the person signing for forcing that Olympic sprint.
Thank you very much, Dara. I would now like to welcome Ms. Helen Hall back to the virtual podium. Ms. Hall is the inaugural Chief Executive of the Policing Authority, which was established in January 2016 to oversee the performance of the Garda Síochána in delivering policing services. She has over 30 years of experience in oversight and audit roles, including with the UN and the World Bank in Malawi, as a partner with Deloitte Southern Africa and with the UN World Food Programme in Rome.
I've lost you there. Can you hear me? You can.
You're back now, Helen, yes?
I'm back. I lost you there completely, Sinead. Apologies for that. So that's great. And I will try to remember to speak slowly and to try and buy back a little bit of time. So look, Thanks to everybody, and thanks for asking me to say a few words here at the end. I think one of the reflections for me is that the title of the conversation this afternoon has been really important, because it talks about working towards diverse and inclusive policing. And I think that title recognises, and I think a lot of the conversation we've had this afternoon recognises, that in Ireland we are still at very early stages of seeking to achieve diverse and inclusive policing. And by just recognising that not everyone experiences policing in the same way, we can then seek action to improve things. And I suppose, as I reflect, human rights-based or inclusive policing in simple terms to me means being fair and being kind. And Yvonne, it resonated with me when Yvonne said it there at the end around treating people like individuals and not making assumptions because somebody's from a Nigerian community, for example, that they're all the same, or that people from the traveling community are all the same. And one thing, again, I'd like to reinforce, and this is a hobby horse of mine that any of you who know me, is that it is, and somebody mentioned it earlier as well, that the Garda Síochána is a police service. It is in law that it is a police service. It's not a police force. And that constant reinforcement to ourselves as a society, I think, is just really, really important. Diversity is not a nice to have or a legal obligation. I think what we have to start to recognise is that inclusive policing will be more effective. Our role in the policing authority is to oversee the Garda Síochána in the public interest and in public, and ensuring that the experience of policing by diverse communities and those that are seldom heard, this has been a recurring theme of our oversight over the past 6 years. And I think it's one that we certainly will continue with. Indeed, that engagement and listening work was given greater emphasis. For any of you who would have seen our 16 reports to the Minister on COVID policing, it was really given greater emphasis. And we certainly found that the Garda Síochána performed really well throughout COVID and really connected with community. But there still remains a challenge in how young people, travellers, people from ethnic minority groups and people from the LGBTI community feel policed, both as suspects and also that how they experience service as victims of crime. So I won't dwell on our work. We do work transparently. For those of you who don't know us, there's a significant amount of information on our website for those interested. It's www.policingauthority.ie. But just to briefly mention that in relation to diversity and inclusion, some of the discussions and challenges to the Commissioner have included the composition of the Garda Síochána workforce in relation to diversity, because as we've discussed this afternoon, it's important that people see themselves reflected in the service. We challenge the Commissioner on the Guard's compliance with the obligation, public sector duty under the IREC Act, and even somebody mentioned as well earlier, the legal obligation to ensure that information and communication is accessible. And then last but not least, around collecting information, and I mentioned this during our last panel, just if we do not collect ethnic information and diversity information, and even more importantly, who we're policing and who we're providing service with, we cannot know how we are doing as a country in terms of policing. So that's something that certainly we will continue with. We're currently commissioning some research on the experience of policing in Ireland by diverse and minority communities, and we've received a number of very interesting responses which we'll be evaluating. But the one thing to emphasise is that for us in the Policing Authority, this conversation for me has been really, really interesting, and I'd like to thank everyone, both the speakers but also the participants. But it's not a once and done. It's a starting point, that's what I would say, and it's something that we will continue to oversee. Again, just a few final points. Just the theme of listening to me is key, listening to individuals, listening to communities. And I'm not going to forget Superintendent Franey's acknowledgement that we should shut up and listen, and then shut up and listen again, and that we don't understand. So I'm going to keep that in my head. It was really, 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 really poignant for me and resonated. And then Donal emphasised again in that theme of listening, but also communication, both physical and verbal communication and that accessibility piece. So that theme of listening is one I'd encourage you all to hold, and just to support the wider conversation, because I do think, as I said earlier, I do think that we are relatively narrow in our conversations, and I'd hope that, I'm including myself in that as a middle-aged white female, but I do think that I'd look forward, and I would encourage another conversation, an opportunity to listen more widely to everybody. And just finally, that openness to research that I mentioned, I think that's something I'd encourage the Guards to partner with the academic community and because I think it offers a really important opportunity to listen, to answer questions independently, and then it facilitates the guards then reflecting, assessing, listening, as Superintendent Franey said. And just finally, I'd like to thank all the speakers, the participants, and I've really enjoyed this important conversation. And thanks very much to the Fulbright team and to my own policing authority colleagues for the organisation of this afternoon's event. And lastly, just to say particularly to Aoife, who has blood, sweat and tears and passion has gone into making this afternoon possible. I'd just like to say to you, well done, and enjoy whatever relaxation you do this evening, because I'm sure you'll be glad it has gone so well. And just thank you very, very much for that from me personally. And I look forward to the conversation being widened. And the last thing which I'm going to steal from somebody I heard in Limerick a few weeks ago is, let's keep going and let's not underestimate the power of incremental change that we can make in this area. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Helen. Finally, I would like to introduce you to the organiser of today's event, Dr Aoife Delaney. Dr Delaney was awarded an NUI Fulbright Scholarship in 2017. She is now a research manager with the Policing Authority. Today's webinar was made possible through funding secured by Dr Delaney through the Irish Fulbright Commission's Alumni Project Fund. Aoife.
Hi all. Before I hand you back over to Sinead to officially close this event, I just want to take 2 minutes to thank everyone who has made it possible. Thank you to the Irish Fulbright Commission, who believed in my vision and ability to pull it off and awarded me the 2021 Alumni Award grant, without which this event could not have taken place. A special thank you to Dara for your wonderful closing remarks, and for Emma for being my go-to person over the last few months. Thank you to the Policing Authority for supporting this endeavour. So many of my colleagues have taken time to support me in areas of planning, IT, communications, and in a myriad of other ways. Also, a special thank you to Helen and Margaret for taking part today and all their support throughout. To Sophia and Grania, who were members of the steering committee and kept me sane. To Cormac, McCall and Tom, my team, who have all gone above and beyond to help and support me with this event. To Louise and Alex for managing all the IT, and to Mark for managing the Q&A. Thank you to the Garda Síochána, who have worked alongside us promoting this event and helped to ensure varied voices were heard, with a particular thanks to Mary Ann Doyle, who supported and guided me in my initial endeavour for applying for the award, and who has been my left hand throughout this process. I have made a friend for life due to this. Thank you to all our wonderful speakers and chairs who have taken time out of their busy schedules to be here today. Without their commitment, interest and belief in this event, it could not have happened. Thank you to our interpreters for ensuring that this is an accessible event to all. Without their diligence and commitment, so many members of the audience would have been unable to attend today. Thank you to the audience for taking the time to come along. I hope you found this beneficial, and if you have any feedback, please don't hesitate to contact me. And last but not least, thank you to our wonderful MC, who is not only a close friend of mine, but also the reason I got a Fulbright in the first place, paving the way for this event a whole 7 years later. Have a lovely evening, and I will hand you back over to Sinead to close now.
Thank you, Aoife. It simply remains for me to thank everyone who has contributed to making today's webinar possible. Our speakers, Ms. Helen McEntee, Ms. Marianne Doyle, Dr. Dara Fitzgerald and Ms. Helen Hall, our panel chairs, Professor Steve Morial and Ms. Helen Hall, and our panelists, Superintendent Paul Franey, Dr. Donald Fitzpatrick, Ms. Siobhan McKenna, Ms. Margaret Tumulty, Ms. Kathleen O'Toole, Ms. Yvonne Cook and Professor Steve Morial for sharing their work, their perspectives and their experiences of moving towards more diverse and inclusive policing. I'd like to invite you to tune in to Steve's podcast, The Cop Doc, which you can find wherever you get your podcasts. Our event sponsors, the Irish Fulbright Commission and the Policing Authority. Our event organiser, Dr Aoife Delaney. Our ISL signers, Vanessa O'Connell and Cormac Leonard. The technology team, Louise Joyce, Alex Eisenbart and Mark Nother. And our audience, you, our participants, for giving your attention and interest and for sharing your engagement, questions and comments. The recording of today's webinar will be made available in the coming weeks on the Policing Authorities and the Irish Fulbright Commission's YouTube channels, and a link will be sent out to all registered participants. Thank you and have a wonderful rest of your day. Slán Chul.
Thanks everyone. Bye. Thanks very much, Sinead. Bye everyone. See you, Kathleen. Bye, Vanessa.